Picture this: the Americas as a wild, untouched canvas. Mountains cutting into the sky, rivers carving through endless forests, and open grasslands so full of bison that the earth vibrates when they move. No roads, no fences, no city lights, just wind, hooves, and ice. That is the stage before anyone calls this land America, and that is where our story really begins. Long before borders, flags, or history textbooks, Native American history already stretches tens of thousands of years into the past. Their origins are stitched together from bones, tools, DNA, and a lot of very cold footsteps. In this series, we're going all the way back to the first people who called this continent home. And it is not just they crossed a land bridge, built a camp, and lived happily ever after. The real story is stranger, harsher, and far more impressive. So let's start with the big question. Where did Native Americans come from? The leading theory points to something called the Bering Land Bridge, or Beringia, a stretch of land that once connected Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age, roughly between 40,000 and 11,700 years ago. Back then, so much water was locked up in enormous ice sheets that sea levels dropped, exposing a huge plain between Asia and North America. Not a friendly hiking trail, but a frozen, windswept steppe that felt more like an endless Arctic parking lot. Now imagine trying to cross that world. The air is so cold it burns your lungs. Winds slice through layers of fur and leather. Snow crunches under your boots. And somewhere out there, a saber-toothed cat or a giant bear might be watching from the shadows. The people who made this journey, probably in multiple waves starting around 20,000 years ago, were not casual wanderers. These were hunter-gatherers tough enough to follow herds of mammoths and bison across a landscape that would make a modern blizzard seem like a minor inconvenience. And here's a twist that rarely makes it into school lessons. Beringia was not just a one-way bridge. While that land was still above water, people and genes moved both directions. Groups crossed, mingled, split apart, and crossed again. When rising seas finally drowned that land around 11,000 years ago, the door closed. But the story it left behind is still written in DNA. Modern Native American lineages trace back to ancient Siberian ancestors, but not in a simple straight line. Somewhere in that maze of movement sits a mysterious group often called the ancient Beringians. They seem to have branched off early, stayed in the far north, and then disappeared as a distinct population. It's like a side branch of the family that sets up camp in the tundra and never comes back for the reunion. Their language is gone, their stories are gone, but their genetic fingerprints still whisper in the background. These early migrants were not just wandering aimlessly across ice. They were expert survivors operating on what scientists call the mammoth steppe, a huge belt of open grassland stretching from Europe, across Siberia, and into North America. Picture trying to bring down a woolly mammoth, an animal roughly the size of a small house, using nothing but wooden spears tipped with sharpened stone, strategy, and raw courage. One bad throw, and you're not getting dinner, you're becoming a stain in the snow. Archaeological sites like Clovis in New Mexico, dated to around 13,500 years ago, show just how serious these hunters were. In the same layers as the bones of mammoths and other megafauna, archaeologists have found distinctive stone points with a flute, a long groove chipped out to help attach them to spear shafts. Some of those points are literally stuck in ancient ribs. That's not theory, that's a receipt. People were hunting giant animals and winning. But here's where things get really interesting. Some sites suggest humans might have been in the Americas even earlier than Clovis. Monteverde in Chile, for example, hints that people may have reached South America by around 18,500 years ago. If that's true, then either humans moved down the entire length of the continent at astonishing speed, or they took a different path entirely. That's where the coastal route idea comes in. Instead of marching through an inland ice-free corridor, some groups may have traveled along the Pacific coastline by boat, hugging the shore past glaciers, rocky beaches, and kelp forests. This isn't a pleasure cruise. Imagine paddling past ice cliffs, landing to gather shellfish and seaweed, hunting seals, then launching again before storms or shifting ice traps you. Boats in the Ice Age sound bold, but they fit the pattern. These were people who constantly pushed into difficult environments and figured out how to survive there. What's even more remarkable is how fast they spread and adapted once they arrived. By about 12,000 years ago, humans had reached from Alaska all the way down to Patagonia at the southern tip of South America. In a relatively short time, they were living in deserts, rainforests, mountain valleys, and along coasts. Each group tuned itself to local conditions, learning which plants to eat, which animals to track, and how to read the land and sky. In North America, sites like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, which some researchers date to nearly 19,000 years ago, suggest that people weren't just passing through. They were building semi-permanent camps, lighting hearths, fishing in streams, and gathering seeds, roots, and berries. Traces preserved in ancient dental plaque show bits of cattails and other plants, and even hints of people chewing pine resin, basically prehistoric chewing gum. Functional, a little bitter, and definitely not peppermint flavored. All of this played out in a climate that refused to sit still. During the late Ice Age, temperatures could swing dramatically in just a few decades. An area that was once open tundra might turn into forest. Rivers could shift, glaciers could advance or retreat, and the animals your family depended on might move hundreds of miles away. Imagine your grandparents growing up in a frozen world of ice and mammoths. And by the time you're an adult, the ice is melting, the forests are closing in, and your hunting strategies no longer work. You either adapt, move, or vanish. And if the climate wasn't enough, the neighbors added their own challenges. This was a continent shared with cave bears, dire wolves, giant sloths, and short-faced bears that could probably outrun a horse. One wrong step on the way back from a hunt, and you didn't just risk going hungry, you risked becoming part of the food chain. Yet even under those conditions, these early peoples weren't just clinging to life, they were building cultures. At Bluefish Caves in Yukon, bones with cut marks suggest humans were butchering animals in the far north as early as 24,000 years ago. That means people were already pushing deep into Arctic environments that most of us wouldn't last a day in. It speaks to more than toughness. It shows a steady, almost stubborn insistence on making a home in places the planet seemed to be daring them to enter. Their toolkits kept evolving with them. The Clovis culture, for example, crafted spear points so precisely shaped and fluted that they're still considered masterpieces of stoneworking. Hunters used atlatls, spear throwers that act like an extension of your arm, to hurl weapons at high speed, turning a simple throw into something closer to an engineered launch. Imagine sprinting over frozen ground, flicking your wrist, and sending a spear screaming toward a moving target the size of a truck. They also knapped materials like obsidian and chert into blades so thin and sharp that modern tests compare them to surgical scalpels. And not every tool was meant for daily use. Some Clovis points are enormous, almost comically oversized for actual hunting. Many archaeologists think they were status symbols or ritual offerings, the prehistoric equivalent of an expensive watch or a showpiece car. Everybody knows it's not practical, but that's not the point. It says something about who you are. And this is just the opening chapter. The Ice Age is about to end. The huge animals are going to vanish. Forests will spread, rivers will shift, and the descendants of these hunter-gatherers will have to reinvent their entire way of life. The next part of the story picks up right at that turning point, when the megafauna disappear and Native American ancestors begin transforming from roaming Ice Age hunters into masters of a rapidly changing world. As the Ice Age slowly loosened its grip, the world of those early Native American ancestors began to tilt on its axis. Temperatures rose, glaciers shrank back into the mountains, and the familiar tundra and grassland they had known for generations started changing into something new. Forests crept north. Wetlands appeared. Rivers shifted their courses, and the massive animals that had once roamed the continent began to vanish. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats. One by one, the giants disappeared. By around 11,000 years ago, many of the big Ice Age megafauna were gone. Why? That's still debated. One idea, the overkill hypothesis, argues that human hunting pushed these species over the edge. Another points to rapid climate change and the collapse of their habitats. The most likely answer is a messy combination of both, a planet warming too fast, plus a new, very efficient hunter on the scene. For the people living through it, there were no scientific debates. All they would have known is that the old way of life was breaking. The great herds were thinner, the prey was smaller, the climate was different, and the strategies that had worked for mammoth hunting weren't going to feed a growing family anymore. So they did what humans have always done when the rules change. They innovated. This new era, roughly between 10,000 and 3,000 years ago, is often called the Archaic period. Think of it as the age of experiment. Instead of relying mostly on a handful of huge animals, people spread out into different environments and built an astonishing range of local lifestyles. They became specialists in deserts, river valleys, mountains, coasts, and forests, wringing food and tools out of whatever the land could offer. On the Great Plains and in the interior, mammoths and giant sloths might be gone, but there were still plenty of smaller animals, deer, pronghorn, rabbits, birds, and bison. Bison weren't yet the centerpiece of a horse-powered hunting culture. That would come much later, but people were already tracking and trapping them in clever ways. At the same time, plants suddenly became more important. Seeds, nuts, roots, and fruits went from extra calories to a core part of survival. Take the Great Basin, for example, the dry interior region that covers parts of Nevada, Utah, and surrounding states. It's not the first place you'd pick for a comfortable life. Hot summers, cold winters, and not a lot of water to spare. But groups living there, at sites like Danger Cave in what is now Utah, learned the rhythms of that harsh landscape. As early as 9,500 years ago, they were grinding seeds from wild grasses and nuts into flour using heavy stone tools called manos and metates. Imagine spending hours each day pushing a flat handstone back and forth over another stone, slowly turning hard seeds into something like coarse meal. No mixers, no ovens, no butter, just the grit and patience to turn things that fall from plants into something vaguely bread-like. It probably wasn't delicious, but it was dependable. In a changing world, dependable mattered. Farther east, in what's now the southeastern United States, people turned rivers and wetlands into food factories. Archaeologists have found massive shell middens, enormous piles of discarded shells, stretching for acres along certain riverbanks. At places like Indian Knoll in Kentucky, these heaps are full of freshwater mussel shells, fish bones, and other remains, sometimes mingled with human burials. These weren't quick snacks. They were major, long-term seafood operations. Picture a community gathering at the river, prying open mussels by the thousands, roasting them, eating, talking, fighting, falling in love, and then tossing the shells onto a growing pile year after year. Those shells are still there, a fossilized record of a long-running relationship between people and river systems. And in some cases, they weren't just eating. The presence of mussel shells in graves suggests these foods also carried ritual or symbolic meaning, maybe offerings, maybe provisions for the journey into whatever came next. On the Pacific Northwest coast, the shift to smaller-scale resources didn't feel like a downgrade at all. It felt like the beginning of something big. Along the shores of what's now British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon, people became experts in fishing and coastal foraging. Salmon runs, shellfish beds, sea mammals, berries, and roots formed the basis of a rich, surprisingly stable diet. By around 7,000 years ago, the ancestors of later groups like the Chinook and Salish were building wooden fish traps in tidal zones and rivers. They made hooks from bone, nets from plant fibers, and weirs, fences of stakes and woven branches, that funneled fish into narrow spots where they could be speared or scooped up. At sites like the Hoco River in Washington, archaeologists have found fish hooks carved so precisely from bone that modern anglers would probably be jealous. They even developed ways to preserve fish. Salmon could be sliced thin, dried over smoke, and turned into lightweight, long-lasting strips, a kind of ancient fish jerky. Those strips could travel hundreds of miles through trade networks, connecting inland and coastal communities. Imagine a portable snack that's also a high-value trade good. Not glamorous, maybe, but incredibly powerful in a world where storing calories meant storing survival. While all this was happening, people were still using the atlatl, the spear thrower, but they were getting creative. In many parts of North America, hunters began adding carefully shaped polished stones to the shafts of their atlatls. These banner stones came in elegant forms: hourglasses, wings, ovals. They probably acted as counterweights, smoothing the throw and improving accuracy or range. But let's be honest, they also looked cool. Some banner stones are so beautifully carved and polished that it's hard not to see them as status symbols. Imagine showing off a sleek, wing-shaped stone attached to your hunting gear, the way someone today might flash a customized high-end bow or a piece of premium hiking tech. Yes, it works. But it also says something about who you are, how skilled you are, and maybe who's watching. That mix of practicality and showmanship shows up elsewhere too. Down in what is now Louisiana, a site called Poverty Point starts to emerge toward the end of the Archaic period, around 3,600 years ago. And Poverty Point is different. It's not just a campsite or a small village. It's a sprawling complex of earthworks, ridges, mounds, and shaped embankments built by people who had no metal tools, no wheels, and no draft animals. The largest mound at Poverty Point is roughly 72 feet high and covers a huge area, shaped in a way that some people see as a bird, others as a pyramid or platform. Whatever you call it, building that thing meant moving millions of baskets of dirt by hand. No bulldozers. Just human bodies, day after day, year after year. That kind of project doesn't happen by accident. It implies leadership, planning, cooperation, and a shared idea of why this giant earth monument matters. Poverty Point also tells us that archaic people were not just local foragers. They were plugged into long-distance trade. Archaeologists have found materials there from hundreds of miles away. Copper from the Great Lakes, stone from the Appalachians, shells from the Gulf Coast. That means people were carrying, swapping, gifting, and bargaining across enormous distances, linking communities that never saw each other directly but still shaped one another's lives. While poverty point rises in the southeast, other innovations are quietly taking root in the eastern woodlands. People begin to domesticate a handful of native plants. Not huge, flashy crops like later maize fields, but small seeds: goosefoot, sumpweed, little barley, and sunflowers. At sites like Costa in Illinois, storage pits and seed caches show that people weren't just gathering wild plants, they were tending them, encouraging them, and gradually reshaping them to suit human needs. Early domesticated sunflower seeds were tiny, much smaller than modern ones you crack at a baseball game. Yet people still saw their value: oil, calories, and maybe symbolic meaning. Imagine holding a handful of tiny seeds and knowing that if you save the best ones each year, your grandchildren might inherit bigger, fatter seeds. It's a long-term gamble, but one that eventually pays off. In the Southwest, early ancestors of the later ancestral Puebloans, sometimes called late Archaic or early basket-maker peoples, leaned heavily into weaving and storage. They lived in rock shelters and small pit houses, shallow, semi-underground dwellings with roofs made from timber and brush. In places like White Dog Cave in Arizona, archaeologists have found astonishingly well-preserved baskets, sandals, and bags woven from yucca and other plant fibers. Some of those baskets are so tightly made they can hold water. Others have intricate patterns, dyed designs, or decorative details. These are not the work of people barely scraping by. They're the products of communities with enough time and skill to invest in craft, style, and maybe even fashion. Even their sandals show variation, some with designs on the soles, as if the wearer wanted to leave patterned footprints on the desert floor. All of this hints at deeper spiritual and social worlds that we can only glimpse. In Florida, at a site called Windover Pond, burials dating back about 7,000 years show bodies carefully placed in a peat bog, wrapped in woven fabrics. The bog preserved not just bones, but hair, clothing, and even brain tissue. Some individuals were buried with tools, ornaments, or items like a carved toy turtle in a child's grave. Think about that for a moment. Someone carved a tiny turtle for a child thousands of years ago. They cared enough to send that toy along into the next world. That act is both strange and instantly familiar. It tells us these people didn't just endure life. They loved, mourned, and remembered each other. The Archaic period also shows hints of body modification and identity markers. In some regions, especially around the Great Lakes and parts of the southeast, there's evidence of intentional head shaping, what archaeologists call cranial deformation. By wrapping infant skulls with cloth or binding them against cradle boards in certain ways, parents could encourage the skull to grow longer, flatter, or in other distinctive shapes. To us, that might sound alarming, but in those cultures it often signaled beauty, status, or group identity. It was a visible sign saying, "I belong here. I am one of us." Like elaborate hairstyles, tattoos, or fashion today, it shows people cared deeply about how they were seen. Of course, the Archaic period wasn't a gentle golden age. Climate shifts like the hypsothermal, a period of increased warmth and dryness starting around 8,000 years ago, made life harder in many places. Lakes shrank, grasslands dried, and game patterns changed. In the Great Basin, groups turned even more to small game, seeds, and roots. Along the southeast coast, rising sea levels flooded old campsites and forced people inland. But the pattern we see again and again is not collapse. It's adjustment. New tools, new foods, new ways of organizing space and work. By the end of the Archaic, Native American societies across the continent had laid down the foundations for something even more dramatic. The rise of settled villages, monumental earthworks, large-scale trade networks, and early farming traditions that would give birth to complex cultures and cities. In other words, the story is about to level up. The next chapter takes us straight into that transition, into mound builders, woodland societies, and the first big experiments with building not just camps, but worlds. By the time we reach about 3,000 years ago, the Americas are anything but empty wilderness. The Ice Age hunters and archaic foragers have already spent thousands of years learning every bend in the rivers, every useful plant, every migration route. Now, something new starts to happen. Instead of just fitting into the landscape, people begin reshaping it on a grand scale. This is when we start to see big, deliberate earthworks. Not just small camp mounds or trash heaps, but huge, carefully built structures that you can still see today if you know where to look. We often call this era the woodland period in much of eastern North America, and it marks a major shift in how people related to land, ancestors, and power. In the forests of what is now Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia, a culture we call Adena pops up around 1000 BCE. These folks had a very particular habit, building mounds. Some were simple, conical burial mounds. Others were elongated or shaped in more complex forms. The Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia, for example, rises about 62 feet high. Imagine that. Basket after basket of dirt, carried by hand, piled up over decades. These weren't random piles. Inside, archaeologists have found burials with grave goods like copper bracelets, mica ornaments, beads, and carefully crafted stone tools. Copper doesn't just appear in Ohio by magic. It had to be brought in, probably from the Great Lakes region, meaning long-distance trade and a sense that certain materials were special, powerful, maybe even sacred. Adena people also had a thing for pipes. Not just plain tubes, but stone pipes carved into animal and human shapes. At sites in Ohio, dozens of these pipes have been found together, suggesting they weren't casual smoking gadgets. Picture a ceremonial gathering. A leader or shaman holding a pipe carved in the shape of a hawk or bear, exhaling smoke during a ritual. It is part communication, part performance, and part spiritual technology. Meanwhile, to the south, the culture centered around Poverty Point in Louisiana is evolving into something we might call early woodland as well. Remember that enormous earthwork complex we talked about? It doesn't stand still. Trade networks there keep humming, connecting copper, stone, shells, and ideas between far-flung communities. By around 1000 BCE, people at sites inspired by or descended from Poverty Point are still crafting clay objects, figurines, and tools that show a mix of practicality and symbolism. Some of the clay figurines are human-like, many with exaggerated features that might hint at fertility, status, or particular roles in myth. Others are more abstract. You can almost imagine an artisan sitting by a fire, shaping clay into a form they have seen in a dream or ceremony. Out west, in what is now the Four Corners region, something equally important is happening. The ancestors of the later ancestral Puebloans begin to shift from primarily mobile foragers toward more settled life. Archaeologists often call these early groups basket makers, and the name fits. They were extraordinary weavers, In rock shelters across the region, archaeologists have uncovered baskets so finely made they could hold water, along with woven bags, cloaks, and sandals. Their houses were mostly pit houses at this stage. Shallow, circular or rectangular depressions dug into the ground, roofed with timber and earth. Being partly underground helped regulate temperature in the desert, staying cooler in summer and warmer in winter. Inside, hearths, storage pits, and work areas show daily life unfolding. Cooking, grinding corn, making tools, weaving, raising children. Yes, corn. By this time, a new player from the south has entered the story: maize agriculture. It starts small. Early maize cobs are tiny compared to the big ears we see today, but they are already important. Groups in what is now the southwest begin to plant maize alongside foraging, slowly weaving farming into their seasonal routines. Over centuries, that little crop will become one of the most important foods in the hemisphere. Up in the eastern woodlands, mound building goes from impressive to "are you kidding me?" With the rise of what archaeologists call the Hopewell tradition, roughly between 200 BCE and 500 CE. Hopewell isn't a single tribe or kingdom. It is more like a big cultural niche that spreads across much of the Midwest and parts of the East, sharing ideas, styles, and spiritual practices. Hopewell earthworks are next level. In Ohio and neighboring regions, they built massive complexes in geometric shapes, perfect circles, long rectangles, squares, octagons, and combinations of these. Some cover hundreds of acres. Many align with solstices, lunar standstills, or other celestial events, which suggests a deep interest in the sky. Imagine walking into a vast enclosure shaped like a square connected to a circle, knowing that certain points line up with the rising sun on a specific day of the year. Its architecture as calendar and ceremony combined. Hopewell people traded like crazy. Their interaction sphere, as archaeologists call it, stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Rockies. They brought in copper, obsidian, mica, marine shells, exotic stones, and more, then transformed them into artworks and ritual items. Copper was hammered into delicate ear spools and breastplates. Mica, a shiny, fragile mineral, was cut into shapes like hands or animals. Obsidian from places like Yellowstone was flaked into razor-sharp knives and points. They also had a flair for dramatic art. Stone pipes carved into animals, humans, and even complex scenes show up in their mounds. There is a famous pipe showing a man wrestling a bear, for example. Whether that scene shows a myth, a real event, or a symbolic struggle is anyone's guess. But you can feel the energy in the carving. Burials reflect increasing social complexity. Some individuals are buried with lavish goods, copper ornaments, piles of pearls, rare stones, while others have simpler graves. That doesn't necessarily map directly onto kings and commoners in the European sense, but it does tell us that roles and status were becoming more layered. Some people had the right to command large labor projects, hold special rituals, or sit at the center of alliances. At the same time, many communities remain relatively small and dispersed. People live in villages of log or wattle and daub houses, tend gardens of maize, beans, squash, and native seed crops, hunt deer and turkey in the forests, fish in rivers, and gather nuts like acorns and hickory. Daily life is hands-on, grinding corn on stone slabs, smoking meat, weaving mats, making pottery, and telling stories by firelight. In the Pacific Northwest, maritime cultures continue to level up. Large cedar canoes capable of carrying dozens of people appear along the coast. These aren't simple dugouts. They are carefully carved and steamed into shape, sometimes 50 or 60 feet long. People use them for fishing, trading, and raiding. Villages of plank houses line sheltered bays and inlets. Each house might belong to an extended family or clan, decorated with painted designs and carvings that proclaim ancestry and status. In other words, by this time, Native American societies across the continent are doing far more than just living off the land. They are reshaping it, building monuments, tracking the stars, cultivating crops, and forging trade networks that run for hundreds and hundreds of miles. What we see, standing on the edge of this woodland and early formative world, is a continent full of experiments. Different regions find their own balance between farming and foraging, mobility and permanence, equality and hierarchy, the everyday and the sacred. Some communities remain small and fluid. Others are clearly gearing up for something bigger. And that something bigger is coming. Soon, we will see cities rise on river floodplains, earthwork complexes that rival ancient wonders, and cultures that engineer whole landscapes to feed tens of thousands of people. The foundations are already in place. The next chapter is where the mounds get taller, the villages get denser, and the social stakes climb even higher. By now, the continent is buzzing with experiments in how to live together. Small villages, big mounds, elaborate rituals, and trade networks that stretch farther than most people will ever walk in a lifetime. But the next phase, that's when some Native American societies start flexing on a truly massive scale. The Americas are no longer just scattered camps of hunter-gatherers and small garden villages. They're growing into landscapes filled with organized towns, monumental earthworks, and social systems that are starting to look like full-on city life. Let's start in the eastern woodlands, where the mound-building tradition evolves into something even more ambitious. The Adena culture gradually gives way to what archaeologists call the Hopewell tradition. And after Hopewell fades, other mound-building cultures pick up the torch. Over centuries, those ideas culminate in what we now know as the Mississippian world. If you picture medieval Europe with its castles and cathedrals, now swap those stone towers for earthen pyramids and wooden temples. That's the vibe. By around 800 CE, in the fertile river valleys of what's now the Midwest and Southeast, Mississippian societies start building big. And the biggest of them all sits near present-day Street Louis, at a place we call Cahokia. At its height around 1000 to 1200 CE, Cahokia is a full-blown city. We're talking 10,000 to maybe 20,000 people in and around the central area, with suburbs, satellite villages, and trade routes radiating out like spokes on a wheel. That's more people than lived in London at the same time. This is not some tiny tribal hamlet. This is an urban centre. Its centrepiece is Monk's Mound, a massive earthen platform rising about 100 feet high and covering roughly 14 acres at its base. No metal tools, no beasts of burden, no wheels, just people and baskets hauling more than 20 million cubic feet of soil. It's the kind of public works project that requires serious organisation. On top of that mound, likely a large building, perhaps a temple, perhaps the residence of a powerful leader, probably both. Below the mound spreads a large plaza with other smaller platform mounds supporting buildings for rituals, councils, and elite housing. The layout isn't random. It's planned, aligned with the cardinal directions, tied to the sun and seasons. Cahokia even has woodhenge, large circles of upright timber posts set up to track solstices and equinoxes. Imagine a wooden version of Stonehenge, where priests and astronomer priests stand at dawn on key days of the year and watch the sun rise in perfect alignment with certain posts, using that to mark when to plant, when to harvest, and when to hold big ceremonies. Food is the engine behind all this. Maize agriculture has gone from small experimental gardens to full-scale staple. Fields of corn, beans, squash, and other crops cover the floodplains. The Mississippian world runs on corn the way later empires will run on wheat and rice. Of course, that means diets shift. In many Mississippian skeletons, archaeologists see signs of heavy maize dependence, tooth decay, enamel wear, and evidence of nutritional stress. Imagine surviving warfare, wild animals, and disease, only to have your biggest enemy be cavities and brittle bones from a carb-heavy diet. Mississippian societies aren't just about food and dirt moving, though. They're also about art and religion. Artifacts from sites like Cahokia, Moundville in Alabama, and Etowah in Georgia show a shared icon system often called the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. Copper plates, engraved shell gorgets, stone tablets, and pottery all feature motifs of falcons, warriors, serpents, skulls, hands, and eyes. One famous copper plate shows a warrior in a bird-themed costume, complete with wings and elaborate headdress, holding a severed head. It's dramatic, to say the least. What exactly is going on there? Warrior cult? Afterlife mythology? Both? Whatever it represents, it's not subtle. Power, conflict, and the spiritual world are tightly intertwined. Burials reflect hierarchy. Some individuals are laid to rest on elevated mounds with rich grave goods, copper ornaments, shell beads, war clubs, exotic stones. Others have simpler, more ordinary graves. It's clear that some people wielded both spiritual and political authority, and they made sure everyone could see it, literally, in the landscape. While mound cities like Cahokia dominate the central river valleys, another experiment in complexity is unfolding out in the arid southwest. Remember those basket maker peoples with their pit houses and mind-blowing baskets? Over centuries, their descendants transform into what we call the ancestral Puebloans. They move from mostly pit houses into above-ground masonry structures, first simple room blocks, then multi-story, multi-room complexes that we call great houses. One of the focal points of this transformation is Chaco Canyon, in what's now northwestern New Mexico. Between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, Chaco becomes the center of a network of great houses and outlying communities linked by roads that can be followed even today. The largest great house at Chaco, Pueblo Bonito, contained hundreds of rooms arranged in a D-shaped layout. Some rooms held food stores. Others were used for rituals. Still others may have been elite residences, workshops, or guest spaces for visitors. There were also kivas, circular, semi-subterranean ceremonial chambers, some small, some great kivas big enough to host dozens of people at once. Chacoans didn't build these in isolation. Timber beams used in roofs were hauled from forests up to 50 miles away. That means someone coordinated cutting trees up in the mountains, stripping branches, dragging or carrying logs across valleys and mesas, and then hoisting them into place in carefully designed buildings. With no pack animals, human-powered everything. Like Cahokia, Chaco shows a deep interest in the sky. Alignments in buildings and windows catch solstice sunrises and sunsets, casting beams of light across key points within rooms and kivas. It's like living inside a calendar that also functions as a giant spiritual device. To the north and west, in what is now Colorado, Utah, and Arizona, Ancestral Puebloans at places like Mesa Verde carve entire villages into canyon walls. Cliff Palace and other dwellings tuck multi-story stone rooms into natural alcoves, accessible only by steep paths, ladders, or carved toe holds. These sites are both homes and fortresses, with a stunning view of the landscape and of anyone approaching. Meanwhile, on the rainy, forested coastline of the Pacific Northwest, complex societies are flourishing without big mounds or stone cities. Instead, their monuments are made of cedar and sound. Groups like the ancestors of the Haida, Tlingit, and others build enormous plank houses from massive cedar logs. These longhouses can be the size of a modern hall, housing extended families and serving as the stage for feasts, councils, and ceremonial dramas. The fronts of these houses are decorated with painted designs and carved posts telling stories of ancestry and rites. They travel in huge cedar canoes, carved from single logs, sometimes big enough to hold dozens of passengers. These canoes are the trucks, buses, and warships of the northwest coast. They carry fishers to salmon runs, traders to distant villages, and raiders to enemies' shores. These societies don't rely as heavily on farming. Instead, they engineer their environment in other ways, building fish weirs and traps, managing clam beds, timing harvests of salmon, herring, and eulachon, or candlefish, and preserving food by drying and smoking. A good salmon run can feed a community for months if handled right. Wealth here is measured not in acres of cornfields, but in stored food, carved objects, blankets, slaves, and ceremonial items. And the way you show status isn't just by hoarding it, it's by giving it away. That's where the potlatch comes in. Huge feasts where hosts give away or even destroy wealth to demonstrate power. Handing out blankets, furs, carved boxes, even canoes, while everyone watches? That's a flex. It's social media clout before the internet, measured in salmon instead of followers. So, by the time we're in this era of mound cities, great houses, and cedar kingdoms, the Americas are absolutely not a simple world waiting to be civilized. They are a mosaic of complex, confident societies. Some live in forests, building mounds and tracking the stars. Others live in deserts, engineering water and stone into sacred architecture. Others ride the tides, turning cedar and salmon into power and prestige. And the story is still building. Because next, climates shift, cities hit their limits, and new centers of power rise just as others fade. Far from being static or stuck in some timeless past, Native American histories are about to pivot again, in ways that will set the stage for the centuries leading right up to the moment strange ships appear on the horizon. By the time we hit around 1000 CE, the Americas are loud, busy, and full of big ideas. If you could fly over the continent, you would see glowing patches of night fires, farm fields, smoke from cooking hearths, and networks of trails tying everything together like veins. In the east and southeast, Mississippian societies are at full power. Cahokia is booming. Monk's Mound dominates the skyline, surrounded by rows of houses, plazas, and more mounds. Wooden palisades ring parts of the city, not just as defense, but as a way of saying, "This is our space. We are a big deal." Life here is organized. Farmers in the surrounding countryside grow maize, beans, squash, and other crops that feed the city. Craftspeople knap stone tools, shape shell ornaments, hammer copper, and mold pottery. Traders move between villages with baskets of goods on their backs or in dugout canoes on the rivers. You can imagine the noise of markets. People arguing over shell beads, joking, flirting, swapping gossip. At the center of it all, religious and political leaders preside over rituals that involve dancing, drumming, feasting, and probably some pretty intense speeches. When the sun rises in just the right alignment over Woodhenge, you can bet something important is happening in the plaza. Offerings buried, fires lit, stories retold about how the world began and how the ancestors watch from the sky. But if you zoom in on individual lives, the picture gets more complicated. Living under a system this organized has perks. Food security in good years, protection inside big communities, a strong sense of identity. It also has pressure. You owe labor to build mounds. You owe loyalty to leaders. If you are at the bottom of the hierarchy, your life is probably a lot of hard work and not much copper jewelry. Further south and east, other Mississippian centers like Etowah in Georgia and Moundville in Alabama mirror this pattern on a slightly smaller scale. Mounds ring plazas. Elite houses sit on high platforms. Below, commoners live in thatched houses built of wattle and daub. Pottery shows fierce birds, snakes, skulls, hands with eyes in the palms, and warriors with elaborate headdresses. It looks like the graphic design department has gone all in on a combination of superhero comic and horror movie. Some pottery and engraved shells from Moundville show weeping eye, designs, faces with tear shapes streaming down. Are they symbols of mourning, war, or a particular spirit? Nobody is totally sure. Whatever they mean, they give Mississippian art a slightly haunted feeling, as if every cup and plate is whispering about life and death at the same time. While Mississippian cities are climbing to their peak, the ancestral Puebloan world is also hitting a golden age, especially in the southwest. Chaco Canyon's great houses are thriving. Roads link it to outlying sites like Aztec ruins and other great houses perched on mesas and ridges. From the air, these roads look almost absurdly straight, cutting across the land like someone drew them with a ruler. The canyon itself is alive with movement. People haul wood, water, and food. Ceremonies take place in great kivas, where participants descend a ladder into a round, partly underground chamber to dance, sing, and tell sacred stories under smoky light. Outside, the wind whistles through sandstone cliffs, while smoke spirals up into a bright desert sky. Chaco seems to function as a ceremonial and political hub, maybe hosting gatherings that pull people from far away. Guests might arrive with baskets of turquoise, cacao, parrots, or shells, and leave with new alliances, stories, and obligations. It is not a city in the European sense, but it is definitely a center. Up in Mesa Verde and other high places, cliff dwellings become more common. These villages tucked into alcoves look like something out of a fantasy novel. Houses stacked on ledges, paths snaking along the rock face, storage rooms, kivas, and lookouts. They are stunning, but also practical. When things get tense, you want a home that is hard to attack. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Northwest, coastal societies are deep in their own version of complexity. Longhouses line sheltered bays. Totem poles stand at their fronts, carved with animals and spirit beings that tell clan histories and rites. Huge cedar canoes glide out over cold water, crews paddling in rhythm as they head to salmon runs or trading partners. Food is abundance with a catch. Work is intense when salmon run or herring spawn. Families and crews hurry to harvest, gut, smoke, and dry fish before the season ends. A good year means racks full of dried salmon and oil stored in containers. A bad year means worry. Managing these resources becomes a kind of science, wrapped inside ritual and story. Potlatches grow more elaborate. At these events, hosts stand up and announce gifts, sometimes stacking blankets, carved chests, coppers, and other valuables in towering piles. Guests eat, listen to speeches, watch dances, and take mental notes of who gave what. It is generosity, but it is also political theatre. If you can afford to give, everyone knows you have the power to accumulate. While these big centres shine, other regions are also transforming. In what is now the Northeast and Great Lakes, societies that will eventually become the ancestors of groups like the Haudenosaunee, often called the Iroquois, and many Algonquian-speaking nations are living in longhouse villages, farming maize where the climate allows, and hunting and fishing in rich forests and waterways. Villages are sometimes enclosed by wooden palisades. Inside, longhouses stretch out like wooden apartment buildings, with fire pits down the middle and families spaced along the sides. Women, especially in matrilineal societies, control fields and food storage. Men hunt, trade, and wage war. Conflict flares occasionally, but so do alliances and trade partnerships. Games like early forms of lacrosse are more than just fun. They can be training for war, a way to settle disputes, or offerings to the spirits. Imagine a field full of players, sprinting, clashing, shouting, while an entire village crowds the sidelines. It is sports, religion, and politics all rolled together. Farther west, on the Great Plains before horses arrive in a big way, people are already experts at hunting bison on foot. They use techniques like bison jumps, guiding herds toward cliffs or steep slopes, and driving them over the edge in panicked stampedes. At the base, hunters and butchers work fast, turning an avalanche of meat, hide, and bone into food, clothing, tools, and shelter. These hunts are dangerous and require coordination, planning, and nerves of steel. One wrong move, and you are under the hooves with the bison. But when it works, the payoff is enormous. Enough food and material to sustain a community through harsh seasons. The landscape remembers this. In places where layers of bison bone pile up like pages in a history book. Through all of this, climate is quietly adjusting the rules. Around 1,100 to 1,300, many parts of the Northern Hemisphere experience a period often called the medieval warm period. In some areas, that helps farmers. In others, it brings droughts that strain water supplies and crops. Chaco's environment begins to show signs of stress. Tree rings from the region reveal periods of serious drought. As harvests fail or become less reliable, all that careful social and spiritual structure gets tested. People may begin to leave the canyon, shifting to other regions where water is more dependable. Cahokia also faces its own pressures. Evidence suggests deforestation around the city, erosion, and perhaps political conflict. When you rely heavily on one staple crop and pack thousands of people into a relatively small area, any disruption in climate, soil, or leadership can hit hard. Over time, Cahokia's population declines, and by the time Europeans reach the region centuries later, the city is gone, its mounds overgrown and silent. But decline does not mean disappearance of culture. People do not just evaporate, they move, reorganize, and carry stories, farming techniques, and beliefs into new patterns. By the 1300s and 1400s, many of the large Mississippian centers are smaller or abandoned. Yet the Mississippian way of life survives in new chiefdoms, villages, and confederacies across the southeast. The ancestral Puebloans shift too. Great houses like those in Chaco and cliff dwellings in Mesa Verde are eventually left behind as people move to new pueblos along rivers and mesas farther east and south. The descendants of these communities will later be known to the world as Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples. Up in the North Pacific, cedar kingdoms keep thriving, their stability buttressed by the predictable rhythm of the ocean more than the fickle moods of rainfall in the interior. In the Northeast, powerful confederacies begin forming that will shape the politics of the continent for centuries. By the time the 1400s roll around, the Americas are full of societies that have already risen, fallen, and risen again in new forms. They have built cities, monuments, road systems, and trade networks. They have mapped the land, tracked the stars, and shaped entire ecosystems to feed themselves. And just over the horizon, literally out of sight, are ships crossing an ocean, carrying people who think they are heading toward Asia and have no idea they are about to collide with this entire living, breathing world. Now let's jump to the moment when everything tilts. It's 1492. On the islands of the Caribbean, the world is already busy and organized long before any European writes it down. The Taino are farming cassava and maize, fishing in clear blue water, and trading between islands in dugout canoes so long they looked like floating logs. Villages are made of round palm-thatched houses called bohíos, grouped around plazas where games, dances, and ceremonies bring everyone together. The Taino leaders, called caciques, wear feathered headdresses and gold ornaments. Not because they are posing for a painting, but because jewelry is a language of power. People work the fields in a system of raised garden beds called conucos, planting cassava, sweet potatoes, beans, and tobacco. And yes, tobacco is a big deal, spiritually and socially. Smoking isn't a bad habit here. It's a way to talk to the spirit world. They even have a ball game, Beatty, played on stone-lined courts. Picture a rubber ball flying back and forth while teams try to keep it in play without using their hands. Stakes are high, sometimes involving tribute, alliances, or honor. It's not NBA, but it's intense, and they were using bouncy rubber balls long before anyone in Europe figured out how to do that. Into this world sails Christopher Columbus, absolutely convinced he is somewhere near Asia. He calls the people he meets Indians, a mistake that sticks like a bad nickname. At first contact, the Taino greet the strangers with curiosity and generosity. Food, parrots, cotton, ornaments. Columbus writes about how open-handed they are, but he also starts mentally turning generosity into opportunity. One of the more unintentionally funny misunderstandings is about hammocks. The Taino love their cotton hammocks, perfect for hot nights with a breeze. Columbus sees them and apparently thinks they are some kind of nets for catching people. Imagine showing someone your comfy bed and they assume it's a kidnapping device. Things sour fast. The Spanish obsession with gold and labor collides with a society that didn't organize itself around forced work in mines. Enslavement, violence, and the arrival of diseases like smallpox begin wrecking Taino communities at terrifying speed. Populations crash, not because the Taino are weak, but because they have no immunity to old-world germs that arrive like invisible weapons. But the Taino are not passive. In 1511, a cacique named Hatue leads a resistance against the Spanish in Cuba. He tries to warn neighboring groups what's coming, that the Spanish worship gold as if it were a god. When he's captured and condemned to be burned alive, a friar offers him baptism so he can go to heaven. According to the story, Hatui asks if Spaniards go there. When told yes, he says he'd rather go somewhere else. It's a brutal scene, but the message is clear. Resistance didn't start in the 1800s. It started almost immediately. On the mainland, in what is now the southeastern United States, Mississippian chiefdoms are still very much alive when the Spanish show up. In 1539, Hernando de Soto lands in Florida with horses, armor, steel weapons, and a seriously inflated ego. He and his men march through what is now Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas, looking for gold and cities to plunder. Along the way, they encounter powerful towns like Coosa and Coffeetuchequee. At Coffeetuchequee, in present-day South Carolina, the leader is a woman often called the Lady of Coffeetuchequee. She greets De Soto with pearls, cloaks, and food, a display of status and hospitality that must have stunned the Spaniards. She is carried on a litter, shaded with a canopy, surrounded by attendants. This is not a simple society. This is political theatre. De Soto, in classic conquistador fashion, repays this hospitality by taking her hostage as a guide. It's a move that tells you everything about his priorities. Even so, the native communities he encounters are not helpless. They use ambushes, guerrilla tactics, and, crucially, knowledge of the land. One Spanish chronicler complains that native archers shoot with such force that their arrows punch through armor and pin men to trees. For a guy in a metal breastplate, that's the sort of discovery you only want to make once. While De Soto is stumbling around the southeast, another Spanish expedition is heading into the southwest deserts and plateaus. In 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado sets out to find the rumored 7 cities of gold. Spoiler alert, they do not exist. What he does find are well-organized pueblo communities growing maize, beans, and squash, and living in multi-story adobe and stone structures that look nothing like the golden cities he had in mind. When his men approach places like Hauiku and other Zuni and Keresan pueblos, they run into something they didn't expect: serious resistance. At Acoma Pueblo, perched on a mesa hundreds of feet high, the houses and kivas cling to the rock like they've grown there. Getting up there is hard. Getting up there while someone is throwing rocks and shooting at you is even harder. When Acoma resists Spanish demands, Coronado's successor later responds with horrific violence, but that's also a sign. This community did not just fold at the first sign of steel. Pueblo warriors use slings, stones, and elevated positions to make every Spanish step uphill a nightmare. Imagine trying to charge a stone fortress, glued to the top of a cliff, wearing heavy armor in thin desert air. Not exactly the easy conquest most European stories imply. To Pueblo people, the Spanish are strange, rattling men, their armor clanking, their horses snorting and stamping, their language harsh and unfamiliar. Oral histories describe them as noisy, disruptive, and spiritually dangerous. The arrival of these rattling people is not just a political problem, it's a cosmic one. At the same time, more subtle, but even more destructive forces are spreading: disease and shifting trade dynamics. In the southeast, after De Soto's expedition stumbles through, his pigs, soldiers, and the germs they carry leave chaos in their wake. Within decades, many Mississippian towns shrink or vanish. By the time later French and English explorers arrive, they are wandering through landscapes full of mounds but lacking the big cities that built them, leading to the mistaken idea that the builders were some vanished, mysterious race. They weren't. Their descendants were still there, reorganized into new tribes and confederacies, carrying stories about mounds that were now grassy, quiet, and inhabited by spirits. In the southwest, Coronado and his men introduce horses to a region that will be transformed by them. At first, horses are strange, terrifying animals. Over time, they become game changers. Some escape or are stolen, spreading north and east. Within a century or two, horses will turn plains hunting cultures into some of the most mobile, skilled riders on Earth. But at this early moment, they are still just weird creatures attached to rattling strangers. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean and along the Gulf Coast, new foods, goods and ideas start to move around as well. Europeans bring wheat, cattle, pigs and iron tools. Natives introduce maize, potatoes, squash, tobacco, tomatoes, and more into global circulation. On paper, that sounds like an exciting exchange. On the ground, it's uneven and often deadly, with native communities paying the highest price. Still, even in this first raw century of contact, you can see something important. Native peoples are analyzing, testing, and adapting. They try out metal knives, glass beads, cloth, and guns. They evaluate alliances with these newcomers. They judge, accept, reject, resist, and rework what arrives. Some choose open war. Some choose diplomacy. Some try to play Europeans off each other. Many do all three at different times. So right from the start, the story of contact is not just about ships and flags. It's about native societies that already have deep histories, complex politics, and strong spiritual systems being hit by an incoming storm and still finding ways, however fragile, to push back. By the late 1500s, the New World is only new to the people writing letters back to Europe. For Native Americans, it's a very old world that's suddenly been hit by a glitch in the system. In the Caribbean, the Taíno and other island peoples are deep in the fallout of Spanish colonization. Enslavement, forced labor in mines and fields, and imported diseases are tearing through communities at speeds no one can really grasp. Populations crash in a few generations. Names of entire islands' original peoples vanish from colonial records. But that doesn't mean the cultures just quietly disappear. Survivors escape into remote areas, join with other groups, or blend into emerging Afro-Indigenous communities, as enslaved Africans are dragged into the Americas. Stories, songs, and spiritual practices go underground, woven into new identities. From the outside, European writers see fewer Indians. From the inside, people are doing whatever it takes to not let their worlds go completely dark. On the mainland, Spanish explorers and would-be conquerors are learning something important, whether they admit it or not. This continent is complicated. In the southeast, after De Soto's brutal trek, there's a trail of busted alliances, burned towns, and lingering disease. The big Mississippian-style centers are fading, but their descendants haven't gone anywhere. They're regrouping. Power begins to shift from huge mound cities to smaller, more flexible confederacies. Over the next couple of centuries, these reorganized peoples will eventually become the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and others. If you could walk through the region around 1600, you'd see villages with council houses instead of towering new mounds, farmers still growing maize and beans, hunters still tracking deer and turkey, and storytellers still talking about the old earthworks where the ancestors once held ceremonies. It's like watching a company collapse on paper, while the employees quietly start a new business across the street. European goods slip into this world through trade. An iron axe here, a glass bead necklace there. At first, these objects are novelties and prestige items. A chief with a shiny metal knife looks impressive. A family with a brass kettle can boil food faster than in a clay pot. But underneath the convenience, something else is happening. The economy is tilting. Groups begin hunting more deer for pelts to trade. A village that once needed enough hides for clothing now needs extra hides for Spanish or, later, French and English traders. It's the start of an addiction to imported goods that will later come with a heavy price tag. In the southwest, the Pueblo world is also adjusting. Spanish colonists are slowly pushing into New Mexico, building missions, and trying to reshape religion and labor. Priests demand conversions. Officials demand tribute. And on top of that, raiders Apache, Navajo, and other mobile groups are starting to get their hands on horses, turning old rivalries into fast-moving, mounted lightning strikes. The Pueblos respond with a mix of stubbornness and strategy. They agree to some things on the surface, attending Mass, allowing mission buildings while quietly keeping their own ceremonies alive in kivas and plazas. Kachina dances go on, even if sometimes they have to be less public or timed to avoid prying colonial eyes. If you zoom in on a village like Acoma or Taos in the late 1500s, you'd see adobe homes stacked up like honeycombs, ladders connecting rooftop terraces, drying ears of maize hanging in the sun, and, somewhere below ground, a kiva where people gather to pray, tell stories, and plan. The Spanish write about these people as subjects, but that's more wishful thinking than reality. In truth, the relationship is tense, fragile, and always on the edge of rebellion. While all this chaos is unfolding in the south, farther north in the forests and lakes of what will become the northeastern United States and eastern Canada, a different kind of transformation is brewing. Along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, indigenous societies are already trading long before a single French ship arrives. When Europeans finally show up with metal pots, knives, and guns, they aren't creating trade, they're plugging themselves into one that already exists. Groups speaking Iroquoian and Algonquian languages, ancestors of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, Mi'kmaq, Abenaki, and many others start weighing the pros and cons of befriending these pale, bearded newcomers. French traders want beaver pelts. A lot of beaver pelts. Beaver hats are all the rage in Europe, and apparently no one thought about sustainability. In exchange, they hand over muskets, iron tools, cloth, and sometimes alcohol. Native communities figure out very quickly that whoever controls the fur routes controls the power. That's where the future Haudenosaunee Confederacy becomes important. Over the next century or so, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca will come together under the great law of peace, creating a political system that is both simple and incredibly sophisticated. But even before the Confederacy is fully formed, these groups are already tough negotiators. They adopt some European goods, but not blindly. A musket is useful, sure, but it needs powder and shot, which you can't make yourself. A bow never runs out of arrows as long as you have wood and time, so warriors often carry both, switching depending on the situation. Picture a war party where some fighters use traditional bows for fast, silent shots, while others shoulder heavy, slow-loading muskets that hit like thunder. It's a hybrid battlefield, and nobody has all the advantages. Out on the Great Plains during this same era, things look different again. Before horses really take off, many plains groups are pedestrian hunters and foragers. They use the old tricks, driving bison toward jumps, trapping them in natural gullies, or hunting them with spears, and later with bows on foot. Big communal hunts can kill dozens of animals at once, feeding entire bands and filling racks with drying meat and hides. If you walk through a plains encampment around 1600, you might see skin lodges, dogs pulling travois loaded with gear, women scraping hides and cooking meat over open fires, and men repairing bows or planning the next hunt. The horizon is huge, the sky is bigger, and the lifestyle revolves around following animals and seasons. Horses are just beginning to leak out from Spanish-controlled lands, traveling tribe to tribe, trade to trade, theft to theft. A stolen mare here, a traded stallion there. Nobody yet understands just how completely this animal is about to rewrite the rules of life on the plains. Meanwhile, on the northwest coast, it's still mostly business as usual for the Haida, Tlingit, Kwakwaka'wakw, Coast Salish, and others. European ships are still rare visitors, more rumor than reality. The real power is in cedar. Cedar canoes, cedar longhouses, cedar bentwood boxes, cedar totem poles. Salmon runs are still strong, and potlatches still structure social life. Massive feasts, where chiefs show their status not by hoarding wealth, but by giving it away. In this period, Northwest Coast people are trading up and down the coast, swapping shells, fish oil, obsidian, and other goods. Their world is booming on its own terms, with little idea that foreign empires are already drawing lines on maps they've never seen. So by the early 1600s, the Americas are not a single story. They're a patchwork of thousands of stories in motion, island societies reeling from the first wave of conquest, but still leaving fingerprints on Caribbean culture. Southeastern descendants of mound builders reorganizing into new confederacies, quietly carrying old traditions into new political realities. Pueblo communities testing how far they can bend without breaking under Spanish pressure. Woodland groups in the northeast turning beavers and wampum into regional power. Plains hunters standing at the edge of a horse revolution they can't yet see. Northwest coast mariners living in a world of tides, cedar and salmon, still mostly untouched by European plans. From a European perspective, this might look like the beginning of colonial America. From a native perspective, it's something very different. The beginning of a long, hard, often devastating, but incredibly creative era of adaptation, one in which every nation has to decide, over and over again, how to survive without losing itself entirely. By the time you hit the 1600s, the Americas feel less like a new world, and more like a crowded stage where new actors keep barging in, changing the lighting, and then pretending they wrote the whole play. But native peoples are still running the script. In the southeast, the big Mississippian mound capitals are fading, but their descendants are not. Communities that once sent laborers to build giant earthworks are now organizing into flexible alliances that will later be known as the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and others. If you walk into a Creek town around this time, you don't see new mounds under construction. Instead, you see a large, circular council house near the center. Inside, fires, smoke, benches running around the walls. This is where leaders meet, argue, and decide what to do about hunters, neighbors, spirits, and now Europeans. Creek towns often come in red and white categories. Red towns are associated with war, white towns with peace. That doesn't mean one is full of villains and the other full of angels. It's more like having two modes built into your political system. Red leaders handle conflict, white leaders handle diplomacy. Big decisions bounce between the two. Imagine a council meeting where war chiefs and peace chiefs are literally sitting in different sections of the room, their authority tied to paint colors and ceremonial roles. You don't need spreadsheets to know who stands for what. The deerskin trade starts heating up as English, and later French traders arrive on the coast. A single musket, axe, or roll of cloth might cost dozens of deer skins. Suddenly, hunting isn't just about feeding your family. It's about feeding a fur market across the ocean. Creek and neighboring groups build trade networks that stretch from the interior forests to coastal outposts. Hunters bring hides, traders bring guns, metal tools, beads, and cloth. At first, those goods look like a bonus. Over time, they become necessities. If your neighbors have guns and you don't, that's not a fashion issue. That's a survival problem. The Cherokee, living up in the Appalachian foothills and mountains, are facing something similar. Their villages stretch along river valleys, with log houses, cornfields, and council houses serving as political and spiritual centers. They farm maize, beans, and squash, hunt deer and turkey, and slowly start adding metal tools into their daily lives. But along with the axes and muskets come less welcome imports: smallpox, measles, influenza. Whole towns can lose half their population in a few years. With that kind of hit, you don't just lose people. You lose knowledge, the elder who remembered the full version of a ceremony, the midwife who knew every herbal remedy, the speaker who knew all the proper phrases for diplomacy. From a distance, Europeans assume these epidemics clear the land. From the inside, it feels like a storm that never stops, one that forces communities to fuse, move, and reconfigure just to stay alive. Meanwhile, in the dry, wide plateaus and canyons of the southwest, the Spanish presence is becoming heavier. Missions spring up alongside Pueblo villages. Priests try to stamp out traditional religion, calling kachina dances idolatry. Colonial officials demand tribute in labor, cloth, or food. Ranches with sheep and cattle nibble at land that once was used for wild gathering and hunting. Horses are now part of the picture in a serious way. At first they're rare, expensive, and tightly controlled by the Spanish. But horses have a way of escaping paperwork. A few get stolen, traded, or bred outside colonial control. Navajo, Apache, and other Athabascan-speaking groups start building entire strategies around them. Suddenly, raiders can move faster, farther, and hit harder. They can strike a Pueblo field, steal animals or food, and vanish into the hills before soldiers can saddle up. For Pueblos, who are already dealing with mission demands and droughts, this is a new front line of pressure. But again, they are not just taking hits. They're adjusting. Pueblo people build more defensible villages higher on mesas, with narrow entrances and easily defended approaches. They maintain secret kivas and hidden sacred objects. Outwardly, they might attend Mass. Inwardly, they're planning to keep their own relationship with the spirit world intact. Within a few decades, that simmering frustration will boil over into something huge. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, but we'll get to that later. Farther northeast, around the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River, a different kind of powerhouse is taking shape. Here, the Haudenosaunee, often called the Iroquois, are weaving themselves into a confederacy under the Great Law of Peace. According to tradition, a man called the Peacemaker, along with his ally Hiawatha, convinces the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca to stop warring and unite. Picture a longhouse, their signature building. Wooden frames, bark covering, fire pits down the center, families from the same clan sharing space. The Confederacy is like a giant political longhouse. Each nation is a hearth. Clan mothers, senior women of each clan, choose and can remove male leaders, sachems. Decisions are made by consensus, not by the loudest guy slamming a table. When Europeans arrive looking for furs, they're stepping into a region that already has powerful diplomats. Wampum belts, strings of purple and white shell beads are used to record agreements and stories. A belt isn't just jewelry, it's a legal document woven into art. As the beaver trade explodes, so do tensions. Groups who tap into European markets gain guns and prestige. Groups cut out of those routes find themselves under pressure. This leads to the Beaver Wars, a messy, shifting series of conflicts in the 1600s where Haudenosaunee war parties push west and north, clashing with Huron-Wendat, Algonquian groups and others. Warfare in this era is hybrid. Some fighters carry muskets loud, slow to reload, terrifying. Others carry bows quiet, fast, deadly at shorter range. Tomahawks, war clubs, and knives are everywhere. Raids aren't just about land, they're about captives, trade routes, and survival in a landscape where disease is already thinning populations. One of the Haudenosaunee's most effective strategies is adoption. Instead of simply killing enemies, they bring captives back, integrating them into clans. People who've lost family to disease or war suddenly have new relatives. It's harsh, sometimes traumatic, but it's also a way of rebuilding numbers and strengthening the confederacy in the middle of chaos. Out on the Great Plains, the revolution is more four-legged. Horses, originally confined to Spanish settlements further south, have begun to travel. They move along trade routes, through raids, and by plain old escape artistry. By the late 1600s, some plains groups are starting to ride. For peoples used to hunting bison on foot, the horse is like unlocking a cheat code. Hunts that required elaborate drives, jumps, and traps can now be done at speed, with riders closing in on herds from multiple sides. Over time, tethers holding packs to dogs become saddles and bridles on horses. Camps can move farther, faster, territories can expand. Tipis, already a mobile housing form, become even more effective with horsepower to haul them. A village can pack up and relocate in a fraction of the time it once took. Warfare changes too. A war party on horseback can hit a rival camp and disappear into the horizon before dawn fully breaks. It doesn't happen overnight, and not everyone adapts at the same pace. But by the 1700s, horse culture will be one of the defining features of the plains. And up in the far northwest, the Cedar Kingdoms continue. Haida, Tlingit, Kwakwaka'wakw, New Charnulth, Coast Salish, and others are still running complex societies built around salmon, cedar, and the sea. Massive canoes carved from single trees carry dozens of people. Longhouses shelter large extended families. Totem poles and carved house posts display clan histories, crests, and rites. War canoes prowl the coastal waters, armored with planks and shields. Some warriors wear wooden helmets and chest armor that turn arrow blows, looking like something between a knight and a living sculpture. Potlatches still structure life. Births, marriages, deaths, status changes, all marked by feasts where wealth is given away, not hoarded. European ships are just starting to appear on this horizon. Russian, Spanish, English, but they are still sporadic visitors. For now, the real currency is fish, oil, shells, and stories. So, by around 1700, the map of Native America has already shifted dramatically from the days of mammoth hunts and Ice Age migrations, and even from the world of Mississippian mound cities. But it's important to notice who is doing most of the shifting. Yes, European diseases, goods, and ambitions are reshaping the landscape. But native societies are also reshaping themselves, creating confederacies, reorganizing into new tribal alliances, developing horse cultures, adjusting farming systems, and constantly recalibrating strategies in a world that refuses to stand still. The storm isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning. But the people at the center of this story aren't simple background characters in someone else's colonization drama. They are strategists, innovators, negotiators, and survivors, and the next century will push all of those skills to the edge. By the early 1700s, Europe is busy turning North America into a chessboard. France, England, and Spain are drawing borders on maps like kids doodling on a globe. But on the ground, those lines do not match reality. The real power lies in who controls rivers, trade routes, hunting grounds, and alliances. And native nations are very much still in that game. In the southeast, the descendants of Mississippian societies have settled into a new rhythm. The Creek Confederacy is emerging as a serious regional player. It is not a single kingdom with a capital city. It is a loose network of towns and clans connected by kinship, trade, and diplomacy. Some towns lean toward peace, hosting ceremonies, diplomacy, and councils. Others lean toward war, providing warriors when trouble comes. If you sat inside a Creek council house during this period, you would hear debates in the firelight about whether to trade more deer skins with the English, whether to trust the French downriver, whether to punish a neighboring town, or forgive and move on. The world is getting more dangerous, but that does not mean people stop arguing over the best way to face it. Deer skins are now big business. European demand for soft leather gloves, breeches, and shoes turns the southeastern forests into something like a natural factory. Hunters bring in hides. Traders hand out muskets, cloth, kettles, and rum. A single musket might cost dozens of skins. A bad hunting season is no longer just an inconvenience. It is an economic crisis. And yet, people keep doing what they have always done. Farming corn, beans, and squash, managing controlled burns to shape the land, maintaining ceremonies that link them to their ancestors, and using diplomacy to survive between empires. The Cherokee, up in the mountains, are doing their own balancing act. Their villages are spread across ridges and valleys, with cornfields hugging riverbanks and hunting trails threading into the woods. Like the Creek, they are pulled into the orbit of English, French, and later American traders. Cherokee diplomats travel long distances to meet colonial governors, negotiate treaties, and figure out who might be the lesser of several evils. Some Cherokee towns specialize in diplomacy, sending spokespersons who are good with words and ceremony. Others are known for warriors. Clan structures still matter. Matrilineal lines still guide inheritance and identity. Underneath the new European names and titles in treaties, the old system still beats like a quiet drum. But smallpox is the invisible enemy in the background. Epidemics roll through every few decades and hit hard. Villages are abandoned. Survivors fuse into new communities. Sacred fire traditions and origin stories get carried to new locations and retold, slightly altered but not erased. Out in the southwest, things are heating up in a very direct way. By 1680, Pueblo communities have had nearly a century of Spanish rule. Missions break up traditional religious cycles. Forced labor drains time and energy. Droughts add hunger to insult. The pressure builds until it finally snaps. That year, under the leadership of Pope from OK Owinga, Pueblo people coordinate a massive revolt. Messengers carry knotted cords from village to village, each knot standing for a day until the planned uprising. When the last knot is untied, Pueblos attack missions, drive out colonists, and reclaim their towns. For more than a decade after the revolt, Spanish authority in New Mexico is shattered. Pueblo people rebuild their kivas, repaint sacred murals, and bring back ceremonies that had been pushed into hiding. It is one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in colonial North America. When the Spanish return in the 1692, they come back more cautiously. They still want tribute and conversions, but they have learned something important. Pueblo people will not simply swallow whatever is forced on them. From then on, Pueblo communities and Spanish authorities exist in a tense balance. Outwardly, churches and missions stand. Inwardly, Pueblo religion remains very much alive. Meanwhile, in the northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is at the height of its power. Their longhouse metaphor has become real politics. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca coordinate war and peace through councils guided by the Great Law. Clan mothers still choose and can remove sachems. Wampum belts still carry the memory of agreements and obligations. Caught between French and English expansion, the Haudenosaunee turned diplomacy into an art form. Sometimes they lean toward the English to counter the French. Sometimes they leverage the French to keep English ambitions in check. To a European general, this might look like unreliable allies. To the Haudenosaunee, it is simply smart strategy. The Beaver Wars, fueled by the fur trade, reshaped much of the region. War parties travel incredible distances by canoe and foot, striking rival groups, capturing prisoners, and trying to control access to beaver-rich lands. For nations like the Huron-Wendat and many Algonquian-speaking communities, the cost is devastating. Some groups are wiped out, others are forced to relocate or merge. Adoption remains a key survival tactic. Captives taken in war can be brought into a Haudenosaunee community, given new names, and placed into clans to replace lost relatives. In a world where disease is constantly thinning populations, this practice is both brutal and life-saving. It keeps families and nations from disappearing. Farther north and inland, French-allied nations like the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, and others work their own diplomatic angles. They use Catholic missions when it suits them, adopt some European goods, and maintain complex trade routes that link forests, rivers, and lakes to emerging French outposts. Canoes loaded with furs head east. Muskets, iron, and cloth head west. Behind the commerce are political calculations about who will protect whose land and for how long. Meanwhile, on the plains, the horse revolution is in full swing. By the early 1700s, horses have spread far from Spanish ranches and missions. Comanche, Apache, Ute, and other groups become some of the best riders in the world. Soon, nations like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Crow will also lean fully into this new way of life. Imagine a bison hunt in this era. The herd is moving fast across open grassland. Riders fan out, closing in from the sides. Hooves drum the earth. Arrows fly from riders hanging off the sides of their horses to use the animals as living shields. Spears thrust forward while the rider controls the horse with knees and voice. The entire scene is a blur of dust, muscle, and precise timing. Horses do not just change hunting, they change warfare, trade, and even the scale of territory a single band can think of as home. A group that might once have moved within a relatively small region on foot can now cover hundreds of miles in a season. Information, goods, and news travel faster. Alliances stretch further. So do conflicts. Horses also change status. Owning many horses can turn a family into a local powerhouse. Raiding for horses becomes a rite of passage for warriors, as important as counting coup or bringing home trophies. The sound of hoofbeats is now part of the mental soundtrack of plains life. Back on the northwest coast, cedar societies keep thriving, although the first real shocks are on the horizon. European and Russian ships start to appear more often, drawn by tales of sea otter pelts that can be sold for high prices in Asian markets. At first, these visitors are just another group to trade with. They offer iron tools, firearms, and fabrics in exchange for furs and food. But with trade comes disease, and with disease comes loss. Villages that once rang with winter dances and potlatches suddenly have fewer voices. Yet people rebuild, consolidate, and adapt. New carving styles emerge. Old stories are told in new contexts. Potlatches are adjusted to incorporate new goods and new realities without losing their core meaning. By the mid-1700s, the Americas are not the same continent they were in 1491. The population is smaller. The political map is radically altered. Some great centers are gone. Others have risen in their place. Horses now thunder across prairies that once knew only feet and dogs. Muskets fire in forests that once echoed only with the snap of bowstrings. Wampum belts carry histories that include Europeans, but still center native ideas of balance and responsibility. From the outside, European maps show something that looks like French territory, British territory, Spanish territory. From the inside, the reality is very different. Overlapping native homelands, alliances that ignore colonial borders, trade routes that cut through imaginary lines, and nations that refuse to be simple background scenery in someone else's empire drama. And as the 18th century rolls on, a new settler power is going to emerge on the eastern seaboard, one that will soon claim to stand for freedom while putting enormous pressure on the first peoples who have been here all along. By the early 1700s, Europe's New World project is in full swing. But here's the thing nobody in London or Paris really gets. They are not just fighting each other. Every move they make is landing on a continent already full of nations with their own politics, rivalries, and long memories. The 18th century is where those worlds crash together in a much louder way. On the eastern woodlands, French and British colonies keep creeping inland. Forts pop up along rivers. Missionaries build chapels among villages. Fur traders paddle canoes so overloaded they look like they're sinking under piles of beaver pelts and trade goods. In what's now the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, native nations are stuck playing referee, power broker, and survival strategist all at once. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca sits in a pivotal spot. To the north and west are French allies, Huron, Wendat, Ojibwe, and many Algonquian-speaking groups. To the south and east are British colonies that keep spilling past the Appalachian Mountains. The Haudenosaunee use diplomacy like a blade with two edges. They signed treaties with the British to protect some lands and trade routes. They also keep a wary eye on French expansion, sometimes leaning one way, sometimes the other, always trying to avoid being trapped by either side. When French and British officials complain about faithless native allies, what they're really complaining about is that native leaders refuse to be obedient pawns. Somewhere in all this, the beaver are getting absolutely hammered. Fur trade competition pushes hunting harder and farther than before. Rivers that once hosted small-scale subsistence trapping now function as highways for commercial extraction. Beavers are not just animals anymore. They're currency. They're politics. They're the reason guns, metal, and cloth show up deep in the interior long before any European soldier sets foot there. Further south, in the interior of the southeast, the Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Cherokee are also navigating a dangerous game. French forts snake along the Mississippi and its tributaries. British traders push in from Carolina and Georgia. Spanish officials still have Florida and the Gulf Coast. It's like three empires are tugging at the same blanket, and native nations are standing in the middle trying not to get ripped apart. Creek towns trade deer skins for guns and gunpowder. Choctaw people build relationships with French outposts like Mobile and New Orleans. The Chickasaw, masters of strategic defense, fight off French attempts to crush them and control the lower Mississippi. Cherokee communities run their own diplomacy, hosting delegations, exchanging speeches in wampum, and sending travelers to colonial capitals. Some Cherokee leaders visit London itself, wearing a mix of European coats and traditional dress, staring at a city that has never seen a cornfield but claims authority over their mountains. Meanwhile, out on the Great Plains, the horse-powered transformation continues. Comanche, who had moved south from the Rockies, become some of the most feared and respected riders on the continent. They dominate trade routes in what's now Texas, Oklahoma, and northern Mexico, extracting tribute from Spanish settlements and other native communities in exchange for peace or partnership. The Lakota, pushed westward from the woodlands by earlier upheavals, are now fully leaning into life on horseback. They spread across the northern plains, building a way of life around bison, horses, and wide-open sky. Down in the southwest, the aftermath of the Pueblo Revolt has settled into a tense arrangement. Spanish power returns to New Mexico, but it's more negotiated than before. Pueblos accept some aspects of colonial rule missions, governors, trading posts, but draw firm lines around their sacred spaces. Kachina ceremonies remain central. Religious leaders keep knowledge alive behind adobe walls and inside underground kivas. Apache and Navajo groups, meanwhile, are riding harder, raiding ranches and caravans, striking back against encroachment, and carving out their own power zones between colonial towns and Pueblo fields. Then the slow-burning rivalry between France and Britain explodes into a full continental conflict. You might know it as the French and Indian War. In Europe, they call it part of the 7 Years' War. But on the ground, it's not just French versus British. It's French plus their native allies versus British plus their native allies, with a lot of communities trying to stay alive in the crossfire. In the Ohio Valley, British colonial ambitions slam right into French claims and native homelands. Fort Duquesne, Fort Necessity, Fort Pitt, if you've heard those names before, they're basically the headlines of a story where native nations like the Shawnee, Delaware, Lenape, and others are trying to stop anyone from turning their lands into somebody else's frontier. Some side with the French, who often come in smaller numbers and seem more interested in trade than settlement. Others weigh British promises of trade and protection against French military presence. Many just try to avoid being sucked in at all. But war has gravity. Battles leave smoking ruins where villages and forts once stood. Raids push families to flee in the middle of the night. Crops go unharvested. Disease, as always, rides in behind the soldiers. When the British finally win in 1763 and France cedes most of its North American territory, it might look like a clean victory on a European map. On the ground, it feels more like someone just removed one buffer and left native nations alone with a very hungry neighbour. That same year, King George III issues the Proclamation of 1763, trying to stop British settlers from crossing the Appalachian Mountains. In theory, the land beyond is supposed to stay native. In practice, land-hungry colonists ignore the line almost immediately, slipping over ridges and into valleys that native families have farmed or hunted in for generations. Some native leaders take the British at their word and ask them to enforce that boundary. Others already suspect that promises inked in Europe don't carry much weight when a farmer with a musket wants new fields. In the Great Lakes region, this tension explodes into what becomes known as Pontiac's War or Pontiac's Rebellion. Ottawa leader Pontiac and other native allies coordinate attacks on British forts and outposts, trying to shove the newcomers back and remind them that conquest is not a magic spell that erases indigenous ownership. Forts fall, traders are killed. The British suddenly realize they inherited more than land. They inherited obligations and enemies. The British eventually crush the uprising with brutal tactics, but they also realize something. Native nations are not going to vanish quietly. Meanwhile, in the 13 British colonies along the Atlantic coast, a new problem is brewing. Colonists are angry about taxes and trade rules imposed by a distant crown. They frame their struggle as a fight for liberty and representation, but their idea of freedom includes the right to push west into native lands without interference. So when the American Revolution kicks off in the 1772, native nations face a grim question. Which side, if any, do you trust? Some, like many Haudenosaunee communities, side with the British, reasoning that a distant empire might be easier to handle than a young, hungry republic whose citizens are already knocking on their door. Others, like the Oneida and some groups in the southeast, support the American rebels or try to stay neutral as long as possible. Battles ripple through native homelands. Raiding parties hit villages suspected of supporting the wrong side. Crops are burned. Winter stores are destroyed. When American forces march through Haudenosaunee country and torch longhouses, orchards, and fields, they are not just attacking enemy bases. They're trying to break the backbone of communities who have lived there for centuries. In the southeast, the Cherokee are split. Some leaders argue for peace with the Americans, hoping to secure land guarantees. Others, especially younger war leaders, want to resist violently rather than watch settlers swallow their valleys, one field at a time. The revolution ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The new United States congratulates itself on breaking free from Britain. On paper, Britain hands over vast tracts of territory, from the Appalachians to the Mississippi. Nobody asks the native nations who actually live there. From the native perspective, it's like two distant relatives arguing over who owns the family house while the actual residents are sitting in the living room, wondering when someone will acknowledge they exist. In the young United States, a new pattern emerges. Officials sign treaty after treaty with native nations, recognizing their rights to land and promising protection, and then ignore those promises as soon as settlers want more room. Sometimes there are payments. Sometimes there are gifts. Sometimes there are speeches about friendship and civilization. Often there is simply pressure. In the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region, this pressure leads to a powerful native alliance. Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, and others form what historians call the Western Confederacy, determined to stop American expansion north of the Ohio River. Leaders like Little Turtle and Blue Jacket coordinate victories that shock the young republic, wiping out American armies that underestimated them. For a moment, it looks like native nations might hold a firm line. But the United States keeps coming. After a series of bloody battles, the Confederacy suffers a major defeat at Fallen Timbers in 1794. The resulting Treaty of Greenville in 1795 forces the cession of huge areas of Ohio and opens the floodgates for settlers. By the dawn of the 1800s, the pattern is clear. The new republic talks about liberty and rights, but its expansion is built on pushing native nations out of the way. One treaty, one war, one removal at a time. The question is no longer if pressure will intensify. It's how native peoples will respond when that pressure turns into a policy that openly targets their very presence on the land. By the time the 1800s roll around, the United States is feeling pretty good about itself. It has beaten the British, written a constitution, and is staring hungrily at everything west of the Appalachians like a kid eyeing the last slice of cake. But that cake is not empty. It is full of nations who have already survived centuries of disease, wars, and broken promises. Now they have to face something new, a country that openly builds its identity on expansion. In the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes, the Western Confederacy's defeat at Fallen Timbers still echoes. Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, and many others have been pushed back. Forts rise where villages once stood. American surveyors walk the land with chains and notebooks, carving it into rectangles for land sales. The forest is being turned into real estate. But resistance is not done. In the early 1800s, two Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, step into the story. Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, preaches a spiritual revival. He urges native peoples to reject alcohol, stop relying on European goods, and return to older ways. Tecumseh takes that spiritual fire and turns it into political fuel, arguing for a united native front against further land loss. Their vision is simple and radical. No individual tribe can sell land that belongs to all native peoples. One nation signing a treaty under pressure should not erase the rights of everyone else. They build a town at Prophetstown, in what is now Indiana, drawing in supporters from many nations. For a while, it looks like they might pull off a continental alliance. The United States sees that as a threat. Tensions rise, and in 1811, American forces attack Prophetstown in the Battle of Tippecanoe, while Tecumseh is away recruiting allies. The town burns. The dream is damaged, but not completely destroyed. When the War of 1812 breaks out between the United States and Britain, Tecumseh throws in with the British, hoping a British victory will halt American expansion. His fighters give American forces serious trouble. For a time, it looks like the old alliance strategy might work one more time. It does not. Tecumseh is killed in battle in 1813. The British eventually sign a peace that barely mentions their native allies. The idea of a single, continent-spanning native coalition does not die, but it suffers a heavy blow. While this plays out in the interior, the Southeast is heading into one of the darkest chapters of Native American history. There, nations like the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole are under enormous pressure from cotton-hungry settlers. The invention of the cotton gin has turned the Deep South into a magnet for slave-based plantations, and those plantations want land. A lot of it. US officials begin talking about a policy that will soon get a very specific name: removal. They frame it as a generous solution. Native peoples, they say, can move west of the Mississippi and live in peace, far away from white settlers. In reality, it is a land grab dressed up as kindness. Cherokee leaders see what is coming and try a different approach. They adopt a written constitution, build schools, and farm with plows and fences. Sequoyah develops the Cherokee syllabary in the 1,820 seconds, and within a few years, thousands of Cherokee can read and write in their own language. They print a bilingual newspaper. They send delegates to Washington. They sue Georgia in the Supreme Court and actually win recognition of their rights. On paper, their strategy works. In real life, it runs into a brick wall named Andrew Jackson. Jackson, a hero of earlier wars against Creek and other nations, becomes president in 1829. He does not hide his opinion. In 1830, he pushes through the Indian Removal Act, which gives the government a legal tool to force native nations west whether they agree or not. Treaties start piling up, many signed under intense pressure or by small factions rather than broad consensus. Land is ceded piece by piece, often in exchange for promises of money, supplies, and protection that are rarely kept in full. When legal maneuvers fail to clear Cherokee, Creek, and others from their homelands fast enough, the government turns to direct force. Between the 1,830 seconds and 1,840 seconds, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Cherokee are marched west to what will become Oklahoma. These journeys are long, badly supplied, and brutal. Thousands die from cold, hunger, and disease. The Cherokee route becomes known as the Trail of Tears, but they are not the only ones who suffer it. Seminole resistance in Florida follows a different path. There, Seminole people, including many black Seminoles who had escaped slavery, fight a series of guerrilla wars against U.S. forces trying to push them out of the swamps and pine woods. They know the terrain. They strike and disappear. It costs the United States money and lives, and the wars drag on for years. In the end, many Seminole are still forced west, but some remain hidden in the Florida Everglades, descendants of resistors who refuse to leave, even when outnumbered and outgunned. While removal tears through the southeast, the southwest is going through its own upheaval. Spanish control is replaced by Mexican control after 1821, and then by U.S. control after the Mexican-American War in the 1840 seconds. Lines on maps change fast. For the Pueblo, Apache, Navajo, and many others, the faces at the top are new, but some of the pressures feel very old. The U.S. takes over forts, trade routes, and mission lands. Officials who barely understand the cultures they are governing start making decisions about water rights, fields, and grazing lands. At the same time, the plains are being pulled into the orbit of a country obsessed with manifest destiny, the idea that it is the nation's fate to rule from the Atlantic to the Pacific. By the 1,840 seconds and 1,850 seconds, wagon trains are rolling west in huge numbers. They cut across Pawnee, Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Comanche territories. Some groups try to tax or trade with the travelers. Others see them as a direct threat and strike back. Hunting grounds are cut by roads. Bison herds are disturbed by constant movement and gunfire. New treaties are signed to keep the peace along these trails. One well-known example is the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, which tries to draw boundaries for various plains nations and guarantee safe passage for settlers. On paper, it looks like a deal for coexistence. In reality, it is the beginning of a long chain of agreements that the U.S. will break as soon as gold, grass, or railroad routes demand more land. And then comes the Civil War. While the United States tears itself apart over slavery and union, native nations are dragged in once again. Some, like parts of the Cherokee and Creek, are pressured or persuaded into siding with the Confederacy, partly because Southern leaders promise to respect their autonomy. Others ally with the Union or try to sit out the conflict altogether. Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, becomes a patchwork of alliances, raids, and shifting loyalties. When the war ends, the United States punishes many native nations for having supported the losing side, even if that support was taken under duress. New treaties force them to give up yet more land and accept new conditions, including the end of slavery within their own nations and citizenship for formerly enslaved people. It is an important step for black freedom, but it becomes yet another moment where native treaty rights are rewritten from a position of American power. By the late 1860s, a bitter pattern has solidified. To the east, most native nations have already been dispossessed or removed from their original homelands. To the west, plains, southwest, and northwest nations are staring down a United States that has just proven it is willing to wage a massive internal war and then keep marching. The era that follows will be remembered for famous battles and broken promises, railroad tracks and shattered herds, reservation lines and desperate acts of resistance. And through all of that, native communities will keep finding ways, both quiet and dramatic, to insist that they are still here. By the end of the Civil War, the United States is battered, but its ambitions are not. If anything, they are sharper. The country looks west and sees land, resources, and an answer to the question, what comes next? For native nations still rooted in those spaces, the answer is not a hopeful one. The engine of expansion now has three big tools: the army, the railroad, and the ideology that this land is somehow empty or underused if it is not fenced, ploughed, or mined. On the Great Plains, this plays out with brutal clarity. The bison herds are still massive at the close of the 1860s. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Comanche, and many others still move seasonally with those herds, their economies and ceremonies anchored in that rhythm. Horses and rifles have turned them into some of the most formidable light cavalry on earth. The United States wants something else. It wants railroads from the Mississippi to the Pacific, safe wagon routes, fenced ranches, and surveyed farms. In between, it wants as few obstacles as possible. And in the eyes of many officials, native nations fall into the same category as bison, things that need to be moved, controlled, or eliminated. The treaties that had been signed in the 1852 and 1860 promised certain boundaries and supplies. On the ground, those lines are shaky at best. Gold discoveries keep blowing holes in them. The pattern is almost predictable. First, miners slip into a place that is legally native land. Then there is a rush. Camps turn into towns. Tents become streets. Once enough non-native people are there, politicians throw up their hands and say, well, what can we do? We have to redraw the map. This is exactly what happens in the Black Hills. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty recognizes the Black Hills as part of the Great Sioux Reservation, sacred ground for the Lakota. A few years later, gold is found there. Prospectors pour in. The United States sends negotiators to buy the hills. Lakota leaders refuse. So the government simply takes them anyway and labels that theft a cession. On the southern plains, a similar story plays out with the so-called Indian Wars. Raids and counter-raids spiral. At Sand Creek in 1864, before the Civil War is even over, Colorado volunteers attack a Cheyenne and Arapaho village that believed it had surrendered. Many of those killed are women and children. Survivors carry that horror with them into every later decision. In the years that follow, the Army targets food sources and winter camps. At the Washita River in 1868, U.S. troops attack Black Kettle's Cheyenne camp at dawn. At Palo Duro Canyon in 1874, soldiers burn lodges and slaughter horses, forcing Comanche, Kiowa, and others to surrender, not because they are militarily broken, but because their herds and supplies are gone. The strategy is simple and cruel. If you cannot beat mounted warriors in open battle, starve their communities and destroy what they depend on. At the same time, professional buffalo hunters, many of them white, move on to the plains. They are not hunting for survival. They are hunting for hides and sport. They leave carcasses rotting in the sun, skulls piled in mountains. Officials openly say that killing bison is an efficient way to break native resistance. It works. As the herds vanish, so does the foundation of plains societies. Feasts, ceremonies, economies, and identities built around the bison have to transform or collapse. Some people move to agency farms and ration lines reluctantly. Others hold out and fight longer, refusing to accept a world where they stand in line for flour instead of riding after a herd. Not all resistance happens on the plains. In the northwest, the Nez Perce, who once welcomed explorers like Lewis and Clark, face a crisis when the U.S. demands that they move onto a smaller reservation and give up lands that had never been ceded. In 1877, violence breaks out after years of tension, and a group of Nez Perce bands chooses flight over submission. What follows is one of the most dramatic retreats in North American history. For months, Nez Perce families, warriors, elders, and children move across mountains and plains, fighting off pursuing troops again and again. They travel hundreds of miles, heading for the Canadian border and possible refuge. They almost make it. Just short of the border, exhausted and surrounded, many surrender. The famous quote attributed to Chief Joseph, "I will fight no more forever," echoes through history. But the reality is more complicated. Some Nez Perce do reach Canada. Others endure years of forced relocation far from their homelands. Farther south, Apache resistance keeps flaring and fading across decades. Different Apache groups use the rugged terrain of the Southwest to strike and vanish. They raid ranches and settlements, not just for violence, but to survive in a landscape where traditional hunting grounds and water sources are being fenced and claimed. Leaders like Cochise and later Geronimo are remembered as fierce opponents of U.S. control. But they are also fathers, uncles, and sons who are trying to keep people alive as missions, forts, and towns squeeze into every canyon and valley. Meanwhile, the idea of reservations becomes the official solution. U.S. policy increasingly pushes all native nations toward fixed tracts of land controlled by the federal government. The pitch is that these reservations will be safe places where native people can farm, get supplies, and learn to live like civilized Americans. The reality is harsher. Many reservations are carved out of lands nobody else wants, arid, remote, or stripped of key resources. Promised tools, seeds, and rations arrive late or not at all. Corrupt agents skim supplies and sell them on the side. Starvation is not an accident. It is a recurring feature. At the same time, new laws aim at something deeper: identity. U.S. officials and reformers argue that native cultures themselves are the problem. They say communal landholding must be broken, children must be separated from their parents, and languages must be erased. By the 1882nd, boarding schools begin pulling native children away from their families, sometimes by force. They cut hair, replace clothes with uniforms, ban traditional languages, and demand English only. The motto at one infamous school is chillingly clear: "Kill the Indian, save the man." Back on the reservations, something unexpected happens. In the late 1882nd, a new religious movement called the Ghost Dance begins to spread. Its roots come from visions received in the West, where a Paiute man named Wovoka teaches that if native people live righteously, perform the dance, and avoid violence, a great transformation will come. The dead will return, the bison will come back, the white world will recede, the earth will renew itself. The ghost dance is not one single thing. It changes as it moves from nation to nation, adopted and reshaped by different peoples. For many, it is a source of hope in a time of crushing loss. For US officials, it looks like a threat. Among the Lakota, ghost dance shirts are believed by some dancers to offer protection, both spiritual and physical. Thousands join the circles, singing and moving in trance-like rhythm on winter prairies. The army misreads this as preparation for war. Tensions spike after the killing of Sitting Bull during an attempt to arrest him. Lakota families begin moving toward what they hope will be safety. Soldiers move too. In December 1890, at a place called Wounded Knee Creek, the fear and violence of that era crash together. US troops surround a Lakota camp where people have already surrendered most of their weapons. A shot goes off in the confusion. Soldiers open fire with rifles and Hotchkiss guns. When it is over, hundreds of Lakota, many of them women and children, lie dead in the snow. The army calls it a battle. History increasingly recognizes it as a massacre. Wounded Knee is not the end of Native resistance, but it is a symbolic pivot. It marks the moment when the old era of open frontier warfare gives way to something less visible but just as intense. A system of laws, schools, and policies designed not just to control native lands, but to reshape native lives from the inside out. By the closing years of the 19th century, most native nations are confined to reservations. Traditional economies are battered, and ceremonies are pushed underground or labeled illegal. From the outside, it might look like the story is winding down. Inside those communities, though, stories, songs, and languages are still being passed to children. Seeds are still being planted in dusty fields. Dances are still being remembered, even if they happen behind closed doors. The next chapter will not be about disappearing. It will be about surviving a cage that was built to make you disappear, and quietly, stubbornly, refusing to vanish. So, the wild frontier is gone. The cavalry charges and bison stampedes that show up in old movies, those are already fading into memory by the time the 20th century rolls around. But the fight for native survival is far from over. It just changes shape. If the 1800s were about pushing native nations off their lands, the early 1900s are about something more insidious, trying to erase who they are. On paper, the United States says it wants to help. In reality, it wants to turn distinct native nations into something that fits neatly inside American society. Individual farmers, English speakers, citizens who stop thinking of themselves as Lakota, Cherokee, Diné, Muskogee, Iroquois, Pueblo, Haida, and start thinking of themselves as just Indians, and eventually not even that. The Dawes Act of 1887 is still doing its damage as the new century begins. Here's how it works. In simple terms, instead of tribal nations holding land collectively, the government slices reservations into individual allotments. Each native person is assigned a parcel, often 80 or 160 acres. Whatever is left over the so-called surplus land is open to non-native settlers. It sounds fair if you don't look too closely, but in practice, it's like taking a woven blanket, cutting it into squares, and handing out the pieces while selling the edges to your friends. The pattern is gone, the strength is gone, and a lot of those squares will soon be taken too. Many native people don't get clear titles, don't understand the paperwork, or are pressured into selling their allotments for a fraction of their value. Within a few decades, tribal land bases shrink dramatically. The land is still there. The people are still there. But legally, the map is full of holes. At the same time, A different kind of assault kicks into high gear, the boarding school era. You've probably heard some of the famous names: Carlisle, Haskell, Chilocco, Riverside, and many others. They pop up like pins across the US map, from Pennsylvania to Kansas to Oklahoma to California. The idea behind them is blunt and chilling. Take native children away from their families, sometimes hundreds of miles away. Cut their hair, burn their clothes, give them English names. Punish them for speaking their own languages. Drill them in military routines, Christian prayers, and proper behavior. If you're a child used to open skies, family gatherings, and ceremonies, imagine suddenly waking up in a barracks full of strangers, eating unfamiliar food, being slapped or beaten for slipping back into your language when you're scared. At Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, the founder puts it in one sentence: kill the Indian in him and save the man. In other words, erase the culture, keep the body. Many students are marched into before and after photos, first in traditional clothing, then in uniforms and short haircuts, used as propaganda to prove the school's work. But behind those pictures are graveyards. Disease, malnutrition, and abuse are common. Some children never see home again. Others go back years later and find their grandparents gone, their languages rusty on their own tongues, caught between worlds. And yet, even there, resistance is alive. Children whisper their languages under blankets. They teach each other songs. They hide small tokens from home, a feather, a bead, a scrap of cloth, like tiny anchors to who they are. Some run away, walking miles back to their reservations. Some take the English skills the schools force on them, and later use those same skills to fight for their people in courts and councils. Outside the school walls, native nations are quietly adjusting, bending, and reshaping under pressure. On many reservations, the early 1900s are a strange mix of old and new. A Lakota family might attend Mass on Sunday but still hold naming ceremonies and giveaways in the summer. A Pueblo farmer might plant his corn in ancestral fields while using a steel plow bought from a trading post. A Cherokee lawyer might argue a case in U.S. court using English law codes, then go home and sit in a stomp dance that night. It's not pure tradition or pure assimilation. It's something messier, survival through blending, picking what helps, resisting what harms. Then, something unexpected happens. World War I erupts in Europe in 1914, and the United States enters the war in 1917. Even though many native people are not yet recognized as U.S. citizens, thousands enlist or are drafted into the military. They fight in trenches in France, serve as scouts, carry messages, and prove yet again that warrior traditions didn't vanish with the bison. Some native soldiers bring their languages with them in ways no one saw coming. Long before the famous World War II code talkers, native servicemen in WWI used their languages informally to send messages that German code breakers can't understand. When the war ends, the US wants to thank them and also tidy up some contradictions. In 1924, Congress passes the Indian Citizenship Act, granting U.S. citizenship to all native people born within the country. It sounds like a huge step. In reality, it's complicated. Citizenship doesn't magically restore lands, protect sovereignty, or erase discrimination. Many states still block native people from voting through literacy tests, poll taxes, or simply intimidation. You can be a citizen on paper and still be turned away at the ballot box or pushed off your land by a sheriff with a court order you can't afford to fight. Meanwhile, the damage from allotment keeps piling up. By the 1920 seconds, it's clear even to some non-native reformers that Dawes has been a disaster. Investigations show widespread corruption, broken promises, and massive land loss. Traditional governance structures are shattered or weakened. Poverty is deep and widespread. In 1928, a federal report known as the Miriam Report lays it out plainly. Health is poor, schools are underfunded, and economic opportunities are tiny on most reservations. It basically says, this isn't working. The Great Depression hits soon after, and everyone is struggling. For native communities already on the edge, it's even harsher. But this crisis opens the door to a shift. In the 1930 seconds, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, a new approach appears, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. The idea this time is to stop the allotment process, allow tribes to adopt written constitutions, and restore some communal landholding through tribal governments. It's a reversal not perfect, but a step away from the break everything into individual lots mentality. Some tribes accept the act, write constitutions, and create elected councils. Others reject it, fearing that US-approved constitutions will just replace traditional governance with something that looks neat on paper but doesn't match their own systems. Either way, it's another moment of adaptation. Choosing, accepting, resisting, rewriting. Then comes World War II. Again, native men and women enlist in large numbers. This time, something famous emerges: the code talkers. Most people know the Navajo, Diné, code talkers, whose language becomes the backbone of an unbreakable communications system in the Pacific Theater. But they're not alone. Comanche, Choctaw, and others serve similar roles in Europe and earlier conflicts. Think about that. A language that boarding schools tried to beat out of children becomes a strategic asset, vital enough that the US military keeps the program secret for decades. On the home front, native women work in factories, on farms, and at bases. Many who leave reservations for wartime jobs end up in cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, and Seattle, getting a taste of urban life that will shape the next generation. The war has a double edge. It opens new skills, contacts, and perspectives. Native veterans come home with a broader sense of the world, sometimes more determined than ever to demand fair treatment. At the same time, they return to reservations that are still underfunded, still controlled by distant bureaucrats, still hemmed in by poverty. In the late 1940 seconds, instead of doubling down on support, the federal government decides to try something drastic again. A new buzzword appears in policy circles: termination. The idea is that the Indian problem can be solved by simply ending the special legal status of tribes altogether. If you dissolve reservations, cut off federal responsibilities, and say, you're just like everyone else now, then technically you no longer have to deal with treaties, trust lands, or obligations. For native nations, that's not integration. That's erasure with paperwork. On top of that, urban relocation programs begin nudging, and sometimes outright pushing, native people to move to cities with promises of jobs and training. Many arrive in places like Oakland, Minneapolis, and Denver to find low wages, discrimination, and loneliness. Once again, it might look like the story is pushing toward an ending. Tribes terminated, children pulled into off-reservation schools, families scattered across city neighborhoods, ancient ceremonies labeled pagan or suppressed. And yet, inside apartments, people still speak snippets of their languages. In basements and backyards, drums still come out. On long car rides back to reservations for holidays or ceremonies, stories get told and retold so the kids in the back seat don't forget who they are. The next chapter isn't going to be about silence. It's going to be about microphones. Microphones in courtrooms, on protest lines, on university stages, and even on YouTube, amplifying voices that generations of policy tried to turn off. So we ended with a government trying to make native nations simply disappear on paper. Termination, relocation, boarding schools, city programs with sunny posters and not so sunny outcomes. If this were a Hollywood script, this might be the part where the credits roll. Instead, it's where the plot twists. Because in the second half of the 20th century, native peoples across the continent decide something simple and powerful. We're still here, and we're not going quietly. Let's start in the 1950 seconds. Termination is officially the policy of the day. Congress passes resolutions targeting specific tribes for ending their federal status. The Menominee in Wisconsin and the Klamath in Oregon are among the most famous examples. On paper, Congress says, "You're independent now." In reality, it's more like, "We're cutting your health care, closing your schools, ending treaty obligations, and turning your land into taxable property." Without the economic base or infrastructure to handle that sudden shock, many terminated communities fall into deeper poverty. Menominee land, for example, is converted into a county. Tribal forests are sold off. Hospitals close. What was supposed to be freedom looks a lot like losing the little safety net that existed. At the same time, relocation programs are picking up steam. Posters and recruiters promise native families a better life in cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, Denver, Minneapolis, and Oakland. Job training, housing assistance, a fresh start. Some people go voluntarily, hoping for work and opportunity. Others feel pushed, with few options left on shrinking reservations. Once in the city, they find crowded apartments, low-paying jobs, racism, and a different kind of isolation. You can't just wander down the road to Grandma's house for ceremony when Grandma is now 800 miles away in a different state. But cities also do something the planners didn't expect. They mix native people from dozens of nations in the same neighborhoods. A Lakota kid meets a Navajo kid at a youth center. A Mohawk steelworker rents a room next to a Yurok fisherman turned factory worker. They share stories, frustrations, and ideas. They see that what's happening to them is not just a tribal issue, it's something bigger. Out of that stew, a new wave of activism starts to simmer. By the 1960 seconds, the United States is already on fire with movements. The civil rights movement, anti-war protests, Chicano activism, feminist organizing, students questioning everything. Native people watch and think, we have our own fight, our own demands, our own ways of doing this. In 1968, the American Indian Movement, or AIM, forms in Minneapolis. It starts with native volunteers trying to protect their communities from police brutality, unfair arrests, and harassment. They do patrols. They provide legal help. They push back. But AIM doesn't stay local for long. Soon, they are riding the wave of what becomes known as Red Power. In 1969, a group of native activists occupies Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, arguing that an abandoned federal prison should be returned to native use under old treaties that promised surplus land to tribes. They set up a community there. They fly banners. They invite media. They write statements with sharp humor and sharper truth. They point out that the island is perfectly suited as Indian land by the government's own standards. No running water, no jobs, no resources, isolated. In other words, a lot like reservations have been made to feel. The occupation lasts for 19 months. It does not end with a clean victory, but it changes something crucial: visibility. Americans who have never thought about native issues are suddenly seeing them on the evening news. Kids on reservations are hearing about Alcatraz and thinking, "We are not alone." The actions keep coming. In 1972, AIM and other groups organized the Trail of Broken Treaties, a cross-country caravan that ends in Washington, D.C. They present a 20-point position paper demanding the U.S. honor its treaty obligations, restore tribal decision-making, and review abusive policies. The protest escalates when activists occupy the Bureau of Indian Affairs building, turning it into a chaotic symbol of centuries of mismanagement. Then, in 1973, the tension explodes at Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Wounded Knee is already a sacred and painful place, the site of the 1,890 massacre where hundreds of Lakota were killed by U.S. troops. Now it becomes the focus of a new standoff. AIM activists and local Lakota residents occupy the town, protesting corruption in tribal leadership, poverty, and U.S. failure to honor treaties. The federal government responds with armed agents, roadblocks, and a siege that lasts 71 days. Gunfire is exchanged. People are wounded. 2 native men are killed. Journalists come and go. The eyes of the country focus, however briefly, on Pine Ridge. Again, there is no neat Hollywood ending. The occupation ends with arrests, trials, and more suffering. But it forces the nation to look at treaties, sovereignty, and the reality of reservation life. It puts native rights on the front page, and while AIM is the lightning rod, everyday advocacy is happening quietly in courtrooms, classrooms, and tribal offices. In 1975, a major shift occurs: the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. Instead of the federal government running everything through distant agencies, this law lets tribes take direct control of many services themselves. Schools, clinics, housing programs all can increasingly be managed by tribal governments, not outside bureaucrats. It's not total freedom. Funding still comes with strings. But it's a pivot away from the old, "we know what's best for you" model. Education becomes a battlefield and a tool. Tribes launch their own schools and colleges. Indian studies programs blossom at universities. Native students start reading about their own histories from their own perspectives, not just 2 paragraphs in a textbook about Plains Indians and pilgrims. Languages that boarding schools tried to silence are recorded, written down, and taught again. Elders sit in classrooms and community centers, sharing vocabulary, stories, and songs with younger generations armed with notebooks and tape recorders. In the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, another unexpected niche of power opens up: gaming. Court cases rule that because tribes are sovereign nations, states cannot regulate gaming on tribal lands the same way they do elsewhere. This leads to the growth of tribal casinos and bingo halls, especially after the 1988 Indian Gaming Regulatory Act sets the ground rules. For some tribes, casino revenue becomes a game changer. Money from gaming funds, healthcare clinics, scholarships, housing, language programs, and cultural centers. A Cherokee student goes to college on a tribal scholarship funded by blackjack tables. A Mohawk youth center buys computers with bingo money. A tiny desert community builds a modern health clinic with slot machine profits. It's not a magic fix. Not every tribe has a profitable location. Not every casino is a success. And gaming brings its own tensions and arguments about fairness, addiction, and outside influence. But for many nations, for the first time in centuries, Economic decisions are being made in tribal councils rather than distant capitals. At the same time, another piece of the puzzle falls into place: respect for ancestors and sacred objects. For generations, museums and collectors have taken native remains, ceremonial items, and grave goods, often without consent. Skulls end up in drawers. Sacred masks sit in glass cases far away from the communities that created them. In 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act passes. In simple terms, NAGPRA says museums and agencies must work with tribes to return human remains and certain sacred items. It is not instant. It involves paperwork, negotiations, and slow change. But it means a Haida community can bring home stolen totem poles. A Pueblo tribe can reclaim sacred masks. A Lakota family can finally rebury ancestors in proper ceremony rather than in some university basement. Culturally, the late 20th century is a renaissance. Native writers publish novels and poetry that win major awards. Artists blend traditional designs with modern styles. Rock bands, hip-hop crews, and folk singers weave native languages and stories into their music. Filmmakers start telling native stories from native perspectives, not just as side characters in someone else's narrative. On radio and early television, you start to hear native voices hosting shows and anchoring news. By the 1990 seconds, the internet appears, and suddenly there's a new space for native youth to connect across reservations and cities, sharing jokes, frustrations, and pride. And through all of this, despite all the gains, the reality is still mixed. Reservations often remain underfunded. Many native communities deal with high rates of poverty, addiction, and health issues like diabetes. Boarding school trauma echoes through generations. Land disputes and broken promises continue. But compared to the beginning of the century, something fundamental has shifted. The story is not just one of being acted upon. It is a story of acting, organizing, suing, negotiating, teaching, singing, and dancing in the face of every attempt to shut it down. By the time the year 2000 rolls around, native nations are stepping into a new millennium with court victories in their pockets, casinos on their lands, immersion schools in their communities, and activists ready to take their fight to global forums and digital platforms. The next chapter is not about whether they survived. It's about how they're reshaping the future on their own terms, with smartphones in their hands, ancient songs in their heads, and a sense that their story is far from finished. So now we've walked all the way from Ice Age hunters on the Mammoth Steppe to the edge of the 21st century. Let's step fully into the present. Today, Native America is not a relic, not a costume, not a side note in someone else's history book. It's millions of people living in cities and on reservations, online and offline, speaking English, Navajo, Lakota, Cherokee, Mohawk, Haida, Ojibwe, Hopi, Zuni, Muskogee, Tlingit, and dozens of other languages sometimes in the same sentence. It's messy, modern, funny, political, spiritual, exhausted, energized, and absolutely not going anywhere. In a lot of ways, sovereignty is the central word of this era, not just the legal kind on court documents, but the everyday kind. Who decides what happens on native land? Who tells native stories? Who defines what native even means in the 21st century? Legally, tribal nations keep pushing their boundaries back into view. Court cases reaffirm treaty rights to fish, hunt, and manage resources. Others affirm that reservations still exist where outsiders assumed they'd vanished, reminding everyone that treaty lines don't just disappear because they're inconvenient. That legal power shows up in practical ways. A tribe runs its own police force and court system instead of relying solely on state agencies. Another sets environmental standards on its land that are stricter than the surrounding state, using sovereignty as a shield against pollution. Others negotiate directly with federal and state governments on water rights and land management. On paper, it looks like agreements and clauses. On the ground, it's about kids having cleaner water, elders getting healthcare closer to home, and communities having some say over what gets built or not built in their own backyards. Language is another front line. For over a century, the message was simple: don't speak your language. It's backwards, it's primitive, it's useless. Kids were punished in boarding schools for using the words their grandparents gave them. Now, entire programs are built around flipping that script. Tribes fund immersion schools where little kids count, sing, argue, and joke in the language their great-grandparents were beaten for speaking. Teenagers record podcasts and TikToks in their native tongues. Elders sit in recording studios, repeating phrases while linguists and grandkids scribble, type, and tap record. Some families pin language labels around the house. The word for door taped to the frame, the word for water stuck to the faucet. Tiny reminders that this isn't just vocabulary, it's worldview. And yes, it's still a race against time. Many native languages today have only a handful of fluent elders left. Some communities are in emergency mode, recording every story they can. Others are further along, with new generations becoming fluent again. Either way, the goal is bigger than grammar. It's about carrying ideas that don't always translate neatly into English ways of seeing land, time, responsibility, and relationships that have been here since long before the word America existed. Culture isn't just in classrooms either. It's on the land. Across the continent, native nations are stepping back into their roles as caretakers of specific places: mountains, rivers, forests, prairies, not as owners in the private property sense, but as relatives who have obligations. In some regions, tribal crews do controlled burns to prevent megafires, drawing on practices that were outlawed or ridiculed a century ago. In others, native biologists and elders work side by side, restoring salmon runs, bison herds, wild rice beds, or desert plants that colonial policies nearly wiped out. You'll sometimes hear phrases like traditional ecological knowledge. That sounds academic, but at its heart it's simple. Don't take more than the land can give. Pay attention. Watch what happens over many lifetimes. Remember the patterns. For a long time, that was dismissed as folklore. Now, as climate change accelerates and ecosystems wobble, scientists, policymakers, and activists are turning back to those ways of knowing and saying, okay, we need this. We should have listened sooner. And then there's the digital front. For centuries, most people only knew native stories through paintings of noble warriors, Western movies with one-dimensional villains, or school lessons about the first Thanksgiving. In the 21st century, that monopoly is cracking. Native creators are writing novels, comics, and screenplays where native kids aren't side characters, they're the main cast. Designers are making video games with native worlds at the center. Stand-up comics are roasting stereotypes on stage and online. Musicians are blending powwow drums with EDM or traditional flutes with hip-hop beats. On social media, native TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram become their own niche, full of skits, language lessons, rants about mascots, beadwork tutorials, fry bread jokes, and serious discussions about land, identity, and politics. It's not one voice, it's thousands, sometimes arguing with each other, which is its own sign of health. If everyone sounded the same, that would be suspicious. At the same time, there's a steady stream of activism. Environmental battles like pipeline routes and mining projects bring together tribal elders, youth, lawyers, and non-native allies in camps and courtrooms. You'll see tipis and smartphones, eagle feathers and live stream rigs, songs that are centuries old being sung under LED floodlights. Some protests make headlines, others barely register outside local news. But taken together, they say, native nations are not just artifacts. They are governments and communities with opinions about what happens to their water, air, and sacred places. Inside communities, there are quieter revolutions too. Programs tackle the legacy of boarding schools and historical trauma, not as abstract concepts, but as real wounds that show up in addiction, violence, and chronic illness. Counselors and elders work together, mixing Western therapy techniques with ceremony, prayer, talking circles, and land-based healing. Youth programs pair teenagers with mentors who teach them how to drum, bead, hunt, sing, code, run social media, or start businesses. Grandparents tell stories at community centers that double as history classes and group therapy sessions. In some places, you can see a powwow where a veteran fresh from military service dances beside a little kid in neon-colored regalia, both circling to drum beats that have outlived empires. And through all this, there's a constant fight against simplification. Outside narratives often want native people to be one of two things: tragic victims or mystical sages. But reality is heavier and weirder than that. There are native lawyers writing legal briefs late at night, and native farmers experimenting with heirloom seeds, native scientists mapping genomes of traditional crops, native fashion designers sending ribbon skirts and beaded jackets down catwalks, native comedians joking about colonization and gas station coffee in the same breath, native Christians, Buddhists, traditionalists, atheists, and people who blend beliefs in ways that confuse neat labels. There are arguments within communities about who counts as native, how to handle enrollment, what to do with casino money, which parts of culture can be shared with outsiders and which should stay private. In other words, it's not a museum. It's a living, breathing, occasionally messy set of nations and peoples. And that brings us to you, sitting here listening to this long, winding story. If you grew up with a version of American history that started with Columbus discovered, and then skipped straight to the Revolution and the Civil War, this might feel like peeling back the stage curtain and realizing there's been an entire cast working the whole time that you never saw. Native history isn't a side quest. It's the main storyline that kept running before, during, and after every chapter your textbooks focused on. From the first people crossing icy land bridges and coastal waters, to mammoth hunters tracking herds across a frozen world, to farmers building mound cities that rivaled medieval Europe, to Pueblo engineers carving homes into cliffs, to coastal sailors navigating fog and currents in cedar canoes. From the trauma of epidemics and massacres, to the stubborn survival of languages and ceremonies, to red power occupations and modern court victories. Every era adds another layer of proof that native peoples didn't just endure history, they shaped it. And they're still shaping it. Today, when a tribal council votes on a water project, when a language teacher uploads a new lesson, when a teenager posts a dance in traditional regalia on social media, when a community fights a pipeline or celebrates a naming ceremony, those are not echoes. They're fresh chapters. So the next time you look at a map of the Americas, try this. Don't see a blank space with a few reservation dots. See continents braided with old treaty lines, migration paths, sacred sites, and stories that run so deep they reach the Ice Age and then keep going. See cities like Phoenix, Denver, Montreal, and Mexico City, sitting on older cities, older roads, older villages whose names are still whispered in native languages. And remember that somewhere, right now, a native kid is learning their first word in their ancestral language, a grandparent is singing an old song into a microphone, a lawyer is citing a 200-year-old treaty in a courtroom, and a drum is starting to beat at a community hall. History isn't something that happened, it's something that is happening. And Native America, far from being a vanished chapter, is one of the loudest, oldest, and most enduring voices still writing the story of this place day by day, word by word, heartbeat by heartbeat.